Welcome back, everyone. This is your host, the DN WhatIf, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Proved Aizawa Wrong. A special shout out to the original creator, Dunyo_. Please make sure to show your support by checking out their work from the description. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Endeavor huffed as he shut the door behind him and stepped out into the hallway. He just finished up a medical examination after having fought a villain, if he could even call her that. The woman was a petty crook and barely put up a fight, hardly even worth his time. He felt his flames rise higher and his blood boil as he thought back to the job. Honestly, why should he have to waste his time with weaklings like that when there were plenty of other capable heroes to do it? And then sidekicks had the audacity to tell him to get a medical checkup afterwards? Just who do they think he is? Endeavor stopped. He took a deep breath. He was trying to get better about that. He had been getting better. He reminded himself of all the hardship that led him to this point. All the lives he'd hurt. He was getting better. He had to hold on to that. He wasn't sure why he'd suddenly felt such disdain that hasn't plagued him in months. Must be the post-fight adrenaline. The red mist that Crook threw in his face had been bitter and burned his nose and throat, but it didn't seem to affect him at all. The only thing strange that showed up on the exam was a higher blood pressure and faster heart rate, both of which could be equated to the fight. He knew he was perfectly fine, and having some inferior hero tell him otherwise. I did it again. Endeavor sighed again. He really needed to pull it together. Especially since Shudo would be coming home today for the extended weekend. He wouldn't want to ruin any progress he'd made with any outbursts. Just have to take a deep breath and stay calm. Maybe taking care of these reports will calm me down. Alright, listen up, you lot. Over this weekend you are to check in every few hours, Aizawa explained. After a particularly grueling week of training and exams, UA decided to treat its students with a longer weekend. It was only a couple extra days, the weekend, Monday and Tuesday, but it was enough to have everyone excited. You are also to stay in a group. Don't even think about going out on your own, got it? A chorus of yes, sirs rang out in the room. Now get out of here, Aizawa dismissed. He watched as his students gathered their stuff with the excitement of adopted puppies. The usual suspects and a few oddballs were staying behind. Uraraka, Kirishima, Siro, Shoji, and Ishido. Everyone else was going home. There was one person in particular who was leaving that surprised him most of all. Todoroki, I want you to stay after for a moment. The boy in question stopped at the door with Midoriya at his side. They shared a glance, but eventually waved their goodbyes as Todoroki walked over to his teacher's desk. Yes, sir? Aizawa sighed. Relax, kid, you're not in trouble or anything. The kid's shoulders slumped a little in relief, only to be replaced by confusion though. So, you're going to your father's this weekend? Any relief the kid had was snuffed out in an instant. His body became rigged, but he answered nonetheless, his voice stiff. Yes, sir, I am. You don't normally go home. You must be eager to spend time with your family given what happened at High End. How has your father been lately? Aizawa kept his tone light and casual, but they both knew what he was really getting at. Do you really want to go home? Will you be safe there? Todoroki always avoided going home. He was one of the students that stayed behind every chance he got, and on the rare occasions he did, before the incident, that is, his feet would drag, and he was never happy when he returned. Aizawa always suspected something might be happening behind the closed Todoroki doors. The kid's demeanor and skill level, the mystery injuries, and Endeavor's general attitude all made him feel uneasy. Sadly, he never had enough evidence to compile a case. That doesn't mean he didn't keep a close eye on his student and try. They stood in silence as Todoroki considered his answer. His nose crinkled a little as he said, He's been fine. Or better. You don't really know. He wanted me to come home, and he is trying, so I figured. He trailed off, unable to explain. Aizawa hummed. Well, so long as you're sure, but I want you to take this. He scribbled on a random piece of paper and handed it to his student. That's my phone number. If you ever need anything at all, don't hesitate to call me. I'll answer at any time, okay kid? For a long moment, Todoroki just stared at the paper. Hesitated. No teacher, or anyone for that matter, has ever done something like this before. Slowly, he took the little slip of paper from his teacher's hand. "Thank you, Aizawa-sensei." "Don't thank me yet, kid. Now get out of here. Enjoy your time off." Aizawa waved him away. "Yes, sir," Todoroki said, bowing low. He walked out of the classroom feeling strange. He walked towards Endeavor's house. He didn't know if he could ever call that place home, in a sort of daze. It's not the first time he's felt his mind drift somewhere else, while his body kept moving. It wasn't anything bad, just the way it was. His mind drifted now, thinking back to what Aizawa did and said. So strange. It was completely foreign to Shudo. Why would Aizawa do that? No one else has. And despite how shitty of a father Endeavor was, he really did train him. It was training. Just training. But training was for a purpose, right? It was to make him stronger. It wasn't for nothing, right? Shudo was so lost in thought, he hadn't even realized that he had made it all the way to the house. That was at least a 20-minute walk. How the hell did I not notice how far I'd gone? He stood outside that looming front door breathing in the fresh air. Even though Endeavor has been trying, that house still feels stifling. The air had always been hot and unbreathable, a constant reminder of his father's presence. A constant reminder of what his father stood for. How he forced his legacy onto him. How he'd train him for hours on end. Do I want to go home? Standing outside won't change anything, Shudo sighed to himself as he went inside. The house was quiet. That didn't really mean much though. Outside of training, the house was always quiet. The leftover habits from a lifetime of hiding. The slight chill told him at least Endeavor wasn't home. "Fumi, I'm home. Are you here?" Shudo called. The soft pads of light footsteps echoed quietly through the house. Moments later, Fumi poked her head around the corner, a sweet smile gracing her features. "Hey Sho, welcome home. How was school?" Shudo slipped off his shoes as he said, "Fine. The same as always." As much as he liked his alone time, Shudo was glad Fumi did end up being here today. Ever since she got her own apartment, he saw her less and less. That was to be expected, and even though he never really interacted with her much, he still missed his sister. She usually came over every other weekend. This one was no exception. The two exchanged casual pleasantries, talking just to talk. It was nice. They'd never been able to do something like this before. It made Shudo feel warm inside. And lighter too. To have an actual connection with his sister and get to know her was a change that he especially liked. He liked his sister. She was always there for him. A quiet presence he could lean and rely on. "Why don't you finish any homework you have and then you can help me make some cold soba for dinner," Fumi suggested. "But I don't know." "And you're never going to if you don't practice," Fumi chided. "One day you'll be out of the house and you'll need to be able to cook for yourself. So, we're going to start with you helping me." Okay." Shudo decided it was best to just walk away. He went up to his empty room. Even before moving into the dorms, his room had been pretty empty, but now it was practically barren. All that remained was a futon, a desk with a chair, and whatever clothes remained in his closet. Home sweet home. Rather than linger on his depressing decor, Todoroki chose to focus on his schoolwork. Just because they had a longer weekend, didn't mean they weren't given plenty of homework to keep them busy. It was Yudere after all. After a few hours, they did exactly what they agreed upon. Shudo joined Fumi in making some cold soba. Endeavor had yet to return, so it was still just the two of them and Shudo had no complaints. Together the siblings made dinner with surprisingly few mishaps. Sure, Shudo accidentally let the water boil over, which made Fumi almost burn the sauce. Thankfully, it was a simple dish with few places to mess up. Their meal tasted even better because they made it themselves. And together. This is what Shudo had wanted for so many years. What he had imagined as a child. This is the love he always wanted to feel. The front door slamming caused the siblings to jump. Shudo was instantly on guard, another force of habit. The house's temperature was instantly higher and heavy footsteps rattled the walls. It wasn't long before Endeavor was rounding the corner. He didn't look very pleased, but then again he never did. They all stared at each other, children and parent. Fumi was the first to break the silence. Hello, father, we have some soba left if you'd like some. The hero just stood for a moment longer, then scoffed, leaving without another word. That was unlike him. Well, now it was. Before that was just par for the course. Recently, though, Endeavor usually made it a point to at least greet his children when he came home. Seeing him act this way made Shudo feel uneasy. Fumi must have picked up on this. Must have had a rough day at work, she tried to placate. Maybe. They finished their meal in a forced atmosphere. Despite Fumi's best efforts, there was a permanent damper on the cheerful mood that had previously hung in the air. It was burned and all that remained was a suffocating ash. Once finished, Shudo returned to his room. He didn't really do anything, there wasn't anything to do. And he had to admit it was pretty enjoyable. No schoolwork, no training, not even bad thoughts. He was just existing. His mind fuzzy and body relaxed, but not in a bad way. Shudo doesn't know how long he had been lying there. It could have been minutes, hours. But the peace didn't last. It never did in this house. He must have fallen asleep, because the next thing he knew he was jerking up into a sitting position. He glanced a look at his phone. 1:58 a.m. It was too early in the morning to wake up, so something must have woken him. His door shook and rattled with booming knocks. And that would be it. Shudo, what are you doing? Endeavor shouted as he burst into his son's room. Shudo was so shocked he couldn't even find any words. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, confusion written all over his face. Did you not hear me? I asked you a question, now answer me. Shudo couldn't help the flinch that racked his body. I'm not doing anything. Oh shit. Well, that was the wrong answer. Endeavor's flames burned hotter, brighter. The scowl on his face only grew deeper. The teen subtly tried to push himself further away as his father stomped his way further into the room, closer to Shudo. And that's the problem. You're not doing anything. Endeavor yelled. You're just lazing around like some civilian when you should be doing something productive. Anything. You should be training. Now that gave Shudo pause. His father hadn't said something like that since. What are you doing? Shudo cried as Endeavor grabbed his son by the arm. He roughly pulled Shudo to his feet and started dragging him down the hall. Shudo pulled against the aggressive hand, but it wouldn't give. Let me go. What are you doing? He pushed his feet into the floor only to be pulled forward even harder than before. No matter what his son said, Endeavor wasn't stopping. He muttered all the way about how lazy and ungrateful his child was. UA has been far too lenient with you. I've been far too lenient. You've been slacking off on your training and I just let you. I can't believe this, Endeavor growled, shoving Shudo into the training room. The boy stumbled to the ground. His eyes were widened with panic and he felt his heart beat rapidly against his chest. He was back in that room. But he hadn't needed to be in here for so long. He was happy he didn't have to. Now this. The kick to the stomach caught him off guard, as did the wall slamming into his back. Get up, Shudo. You need to be on guard in the face of an attack. At least he had the sense to dodge this punch. Shudo rolled out the way, sending a wave of ice shooting at his father. It melted near instantaneously. Endeavor sneered, is that the best you can do? You're going to have to do better than that. You need to improve, Shudo, which means I'm not holding back. Shit. Flames roared to life and came spiraling towards the hero in training. He barely managed to drop, his hair getting singed in the process. Shudo tried to counter with fire of his own, but it was easily engulfed in Endeavor's power. The flames came right back at him, and this time he wasn't so lucky. Despite the fire catching Shudo's left side, the pain was enough to stall him, slow him down. He wasn't fast enough to get away from Endeavor when his hand shot out and grabbed him by the arm again. This time he pivoted on his foot and slammed Shudo to the ground. His boot was next to follow, moving full force onto his son's right leg. A strangled yelp escaped from the teen's mouth as he felt something crack. This wasn't how his father usually fought. This was far more violent. Brutal. It was almost like he wasn't actually trying to train him. Any train of thought Shudo had was cut off by Endeavor shifting his foot, grinding it harder into his leg. If I were a villain, you'd be dead already. You have to do better, be better. Do you really expect to become the #1 hero if this is how you fight? I need to move. With as much strength as he could manage, Shudo released an ice burst that covered Endeavor and froze him to the floor. He pulled his leg free and limped as fast as he could away from the training room, freezing the door on his way out. Shudo stumbled his way through the halls, falling and pushing against the walls. He thought he heard a concerned voice call his name, but he couldn't stop now. Don't run from me, Shudo. He dove through the nearest door he could find, a linen closet. He let his achy body slide down onto the floor, a bruised arm wrapped around his midsection towards the burn on his left. He hesitantly lifted his torn, burnt shirt up to examine the damage. The burn felt tight on his skin, bright pink and raw. The edges were tinged black. The skin was already peeling. The little blisters forming were enough to nauseate him. The teen tried to ice the wound, but the second his fingers gently brushed against the burn it made his stomach lurch. Vomit rose up in his throat, but he doesn't have time for that. Calm down, breathe. With shaky hands he pulled out his phone that he never had the chance to take out of his pocket. He needed to call someone. The police? No, they wouldn't get here in time. Hell, they might not come at all. This was the #2 hero's house after all. Midoriya? Ida? Uraraka? Bakugo? No, what was he thinking? He couldn't call a classmate. They may be strong, but this was way too dangerous. Who can he call? If you ever need anything at all, don't hesitate to call me. Aizawa-sensei. Shudo fished the slip of paper out of his pocket and dialed in the number. 1 ring, then 2. 3. Pick up, please I'm begging you, pick up. Aizawa here. The relief he felt was almost dizzying. Aizawa-sensei, A high-pitched scream cut off his sentence. Fumi! What's happening out there? It was hot before, but now it felt unbearable. Literally. It felt harder to breathe all of a sudden. Todoroki, is that you? What's going on? I need you to talk to me, Aizawa's voice said through the phone, his tone dripping with panic and concern. In a harsh whisper, Shudo said, I need help. I need help, Aizawa-sensei, please. Where are you? I'm at home, Endeavor's house. I don't know what's going on. Endeavor. Shudo froze on the spot. The voice was getting closer. He put a hand over his mouth and nose, trying to silence his breathing. It felt like there was a vice grip of panic around his throat. He clenched his eyes tightly shut. Todoroki, what's happening? No. Shudo scrambled to silence his phone, hang up, undo his mistake. Something, anything. The door was wrenched off its track. There you are, you pathetic excuse for a hero. Shudo wasted no time reacting this time. He shot out between Endeavor's legs and booked it. Out of the safety of the closet, he saw just how bad things have gotten. The house was on fire. Billowing black smoke curled in the air, taking everything into its tendrils. Shudo coughed harshly against the dirty air, not that there was anything better to breathe in. It didn't help that Endeavor caught him in the side with a kick. Right on the burn. Nothing could stop the nauseous pain that rippled through his entire body. This time he couldn't stop and Shudo found himself doubled over, vomiting. His throat burned from the combination of bile and smoke. The rough coughs that tore through his throat were not helping. The front door was so close. It was right there. Trying to get out of training again, Shudo? No wonder you're so weak. Endeavor mocked. Endeavor swept his son's leg and pinned him under the older hero. He grabbed the boy's two-toned hair from behind and slammed his face into the ground. And again. After the 4th time, Shudo couldn't fight back. The world was spinning around him, and it was getting harder to focus. Father, stop. Please. His pleas fell on deaf ears. All Endeavor did was roll Shudo onto his back and press a knee into his chest. His son's face was bruised, bloodied. His white hair was starting to stain crimson from the blood that pooled on the floor. Not that he could really see. All Endeavor saw was red. Do you know why you failed, Shudo? The teen looked up at his father with steadily glassy eyes. The smoke was getting thicker and darker. The fire hotter, consuming everything in its path. He could barely focus on his father's face or what he was saying. You failed. Endeavor slowly wrapped his hands around Shudo's neck, because you are weak. He added pressure, watching as his son started to struggle more and more. His legs kicked weakly from under his father, hands prying at his father's. His choked gasps were becoming weaker and more desperate. With how you are now, you will never be a hero. You couldn't surpass All Might and you will never be able to surpass me. Shudo could feel himself fading. His lungs ached with the need for air. I never should have stopped training you. No, I should have never let you go to you worthless son of a bitch. First two, then you. It seems all I've ever trained are failures. I should have tried again after you. Maybe then I wouldn't be stuck with such a worthless child. The fire on Endeavor's face was suddenly snuffed. Strong branches caught the hero off guard and pushed him off and away from his son. Through the haze that covered his mind, Shudo vaguely registered the feeling of something wrapping tightly around his chest. Before he knew it, he was being pulled away. A pair of strong arms wrapped tightly around him, his face pressed into a dark fabric. Roki, me? Open, or t? Geez, that was loud. And he didn't even understand most of it. He did understand that he didn't appreciate being shaken. Shudo couldn't discern how rough it actually was, but it certainly felt like he was being given whiplash. He tried to say as much, but his mouth was filled with cotton. Sour-tasting cotton. All that managed to come out was a pathetic groan. Or maybe it was a whimper. Something was tapping his face. Todoroki, open your eyes. Open my eyes? Since when were they closed? With much more effort than he'd care to admit, Shudo opened his eyes. It was largely pointless. Everything was blurry like he was underwater. He stared at the dark mass in front of him with the large, concerned eyes, a scar under one of them. Aizawa-sensei, his mind helpfully supplied. He actually came. Shudo turned his heavy head to the side, towards the massive source of heat. A blur of red, orange, and yellow flickered in his view. Fire. My house. My house is on fire. I'm surprised it hadn't happened earlier. He'd laugh if he could at that. There wasn't nearly enough air for that, though. Fumi would be mad if she knew about that particular thought. A realization shot through his mind as sharp and clear as glass. Fumi. He needed to save her. Shudo squirmed in the grasp, desperately reaching back to the flames. Try as he might, though, the grip on him was ironclad. The more he struggled, the more his vision grayed. Todoroki, what are you doing? Stop struggling, you'll hurt yourself more. He vaguely heard the demand, but he paid it no mind. There was a greater need in mind. He needed to save his sister. Todoro, Shudo, why are you fighting? It's okay. Sis. The grunted, weak response tore through Shudo's abused throat. He needed them to know though. My si, sister. Inside. He didn't even get the chance to finish his sentence before his world went black. When Todoroki left UA that day, Aizawa didn't really know if Todoroki would use his number. I mean, he hoped he didn't need to, but if he did, God, he hoped that kid had enough common sense to use it. Knowing this class, that's probably a stretch. Aizawa groaned at the thought, letting his head fall onto his desk. It probably wasn't even that far off from the truth. You okay, Zawa? Yamada asked from his desk. He stared at his best friend, no matter how much Aizawa denied otherwise, who was curled up at his desk in his signature yellow sleeping bag. It wasn't unusual to hear his friend grumble after work, but that doesn't mean he wasn't invested every time. Aizawa shifted in his sleeping bag so that he was facing his fellow teacher. I'm fine, just frustrated, I guess. About what? Todoroki. And no, I don't want to talk about it. Ah man, what's up with him? Yamada asked, completely ignoring his friend's statement. I don't know why I thought he'd listen. He went home this weekend and it's a bit strange as all. The voice hero stood up and walked over to his friend. He poked and pulled at his faces teasingly. Don't tell me scary, stoic Shota is worried for his student? Aizawa's eyes flashed red as he swatted the hand away. Could you at least try to act your age? And just because I'm tough on them doesn't mean I don't care. I'm still a teacher after all. You're worried about Endeavor, aren't you? Yamada sounded uncharacteristically serious. It honestly caught Aizawa by surprise. It must have shown because his blonde friend just shrugged. I'm still a teacher, and I've noticed the way Todoroki acts. I've only ever worked a couple jobs with Endeavor, but I've never been a fan. Aizawa didn't need to be reminded. Most flashy heroes he disliked, but Endeavor was on a whole other level. His arrogance and pride towered so high, he'd refused certain jobs before. Hell, the underground hero had seen better cooperation between two-headed snakes than from that pro. Sure, Endeavor was a great pro, he couldn't deny that. But a good hero doesn't make a good man. Ugh, just thinking about the logistics of morality and redemption were giving him a headache. And he didn't even really know anything. He'll be okay, Sho, Yamada said. He rested a hand on his friend's shoulder, giving a comforting squeeze. He better be, Aizawa sighed. Because I don't know what I'd do with myself if he wasn't. I better get going. I've got to get ready for patrol, he announced. His bones cracked and popped as he stood. As he walked out the room, he heard Yamada shout more assurances. Aizawa was glad to be out of the room already. He didn't think he could handle the confused looks of the other staff members. He loved the blonde, but man, he was a lot. Getting ready for patrol mostly consisted of going home, feeding his cat, and trying to pass the time while he waited for night to fall. As soon as Aizawa walked through the door, Mei circled and nipped at his leg. Yeah, I'm coming. The cat mewled impatiently, taking another nip at his leg. It wasn't until after her food was placed on the floor in front of her, did she purr and meow. But I see how I'm appreciated. With that taken care of, Aizawa went to the fridge and grabbed one of the random meals that Yamada had stocked his fridge with after he forgot to eat for a couple of days. An appreciated gesture to be sure, but it did make him feel a bit like a child. He didn't bother heating up the rice and fish, electing to eat it cold. He tried to keep his mind blank, off his worries. There was nothing he could do now, ruminating on it would just make him anxious and off his game. God, what he really needed was a nap. Maybe he'd take one before he went out. He still had time. The thought of a nap seemed so heavenly, Aizawa practically inhaled his food. Now, taste later. Soon enough he was lying down on the couch, too exhausted to have walked to his bedroom, with his phone set to wake him up in 2 hours. Sleep pulled at his eyes so much, he barely noticed Mei curling up on top of him. Aizawa dreamt. He usually did. As of late though, his dreams weren't pleasant. Tonight was no different. He dreamed of the Yugi. His body twitched with the memory of his injuries. All the what-ifs circling, torturing his mind. What if he couldn't use his quirk in time to save Azui? What if All Might hadn't shown up? What if he had died? Who would have been there to protect his students? Who would have been injured, captured, or even killed? He dreamed of the training camp. So many places where things could have taken a far worse turn. No matter what the media or others said, it really was a best-case scenario that only one student was captured. Everyone survived. And the injuries were fewer than they could have been. Not that he didn't feel any less guilty. He dreamed of fire. Bright, unrelenting fire. Aizawa's eyes shot open. To a face full of white and brown fur. He groaned softly, catching Mei's attention. She nuzzled her face into his and chirped. Do you have to sleep practically on my face? Mei meowed in response. She somehow looked smug, blue eyes twinkling. I know. You're a tiny pain in the ass, but I love you. If he happened to laugh at the tiny paw that tapped him on the nose, nobody had to know. Finally noticing the beeping alarm, Aizawa silenced his phone and sat up. Out the window night had fallen, blanketing the sky in blackness. Despite having taken a decent length nap, he felt even more tired than before. Exhaustion filled his entire body, every limb, muscle, and nerve. God, his eyeballs already burned. And the eye drops he put in didn't help. Fantastic. It's not going to get any better, so I might as well get going. The night air refreshed the underground hero. Crouched on top of a building, the lights shimmered brighter. It was honestly beautiful watching the different colored lights below. It almost made Aizawa forget how much human garbage roamed the very streets he admired. Bonus, the cool air managed to awaken him some. Enough to at least not completely loathe his very existence and actually get him to start working. Ever since Stain and All Might's retirement, villain activity has been weird. Sure, there'd been a rise in big, organized crime groups, but there'd been a spike in petty crime too. It seemed everyone thought they could be the next hotshot villain. It just meant that Aizawa had more work to take care of than usual. In the span of 3.5 hours and a 20-kilometer radius, he had thwarted 5 convenience store robberies, 2 harassments, 10 different drunken fights, and 1 drug deal. Aizawa was exhausted before. Now coupled with sheer irritation, he could practically feel his body and mind tapping out. Hell, his soul was tapping out. Aizawa was in the middle of lecturing some delinquent wannabe when his phone rang. "Kid, if I catch you trying to steal again, I won't be so lenient, got it?" He threatened, letting his quirk flash for maximum effect. Once the kid nodded, he finally picked up his phone. "Aizawa here." There was the slightest pause before it doesn't say. Any lingering sleepiness Aizawa felt instantly dissolved when he heard that voice. Adrenaline started pushing through his veins the second he heard a high-pitched scream on the other end of the phone. "Todoroki, is that you? What's going on? I need you to talk to me." Aizawa tried to stay calm. Panicking would do no one any good, but even he could tell his tone wasn't as steady as he tried to make it. I need help." "Need help, Aizawa-sensei, please?" Anger and rattling fear for his student burned his body. He had never heard Todoroki sound like that. He never should have had to. No one should ever make his students sound like that. Aizawa already flung himself back onto the rooftop, asking, "Where are you?" "I'm at home, Endeavor's house." "I don't know what's going on." "Endeavor, he what?" the hero asked, but his question was drowned out by a shout on the other end that even he could hear. "Todoroki, what's happening?" He never got an answer. The call didn't end. Aizawa could hear so much noise. Shouting, wood splintering, and the ragged breathing of his student. He tried calling for Todoroki's attention again, but it was futile. Eventually, there was a cracking and the call suddenly dropped. It didn't matter much anymore. Aizawa was already running across the rooftops, propelling himself forward with his capture weapon. From here, the Todoroki residence was more or less 30 minutes away. He was determined to make it in 12 minutes. As he moved, he pulled out his phone and called Yamada, Namuri, the police, and for any hero in the area to get there now. Whatever Endeavor did, he would make him regret it. As he got closer to Mizudafu, he could see a large plume of black smoke rising in the distance. The air everywhere felt thick and heavy with it. What truly terrified him was how close it was to his destination. Aizawa made it in 10 minutes. And what he saw made his stomach sink. The house, the place where his student pleaded for help, was engulfed in flames. The only solace the underground hero had was that police, fire department, and other heroes were arriving on the scene. Aizawa ran up to Yamada, desperation visible in every part of his body. "What's happened?" "You haven't missed anything. They just managed to control some of the fire and we're about to bust in now." Good, Aizawa thought. He didn't think he would be able to wait if that weren't the case. "All right, we're moving in." An officer shouted. 3, 2. The door burst open and they saw Endeavor, pinning his youngest son under him, choking him. Everything seemed to happen at once. Aizawa snuffed out his quirk as easily as blowing out a candle. Kamui Woods, an ironic hero to have on the job, launched a lacquered chain prison at Endeavor. It caught the so-called hero off guard, enough to force him away from the younger Todoroki. As soon as the opportunity arose, Aizawa wrapped his capture weapon around his student and pulled him into his arms. Others began to move in, but not Aizawa. He stayed knelt on the floor with his student pressed against his chest. His living, breathing student. After what felt like not long enough, it could never be long enough, the hero pulled away to get a better look at Todoroki. The kid was an absolute mess. His face was scored with splinters and scrapes. Red absolutely coated his skin and drenched his hair to the point he was almost symmetrical. Oh God, and the bruising. His neck and arm were swollen, black and purple already. His leg looked almost crooked and there was a bruise in the distinct shape of a boot. Aizawa caught a glance of char on Todoroki's shirt. "Please no." Gently, the hero raised the shirt. Someone would need to hold him back, because Aizawa was going to kill Endeavor. The burn was terrible. Spanning, from his upper ribs down to just above his hip looked red. His skin peeled, blisters burst, and the edges blackened. Aizawa could feel his blood boiling. Push it aside. Focus. He readjusted his hold, taking hold of his shoulders to carefully shake the boy. Todoroki, can you hear me? Open your eyes. Todoroki's mouth shifted and turned into a grimace. He did eventually respond with a pathetic, painful whimper. With 2 fingers, Aizawa tapped at his face. He needed the kid to look at him, needed to see those eyes. Todoroki, open your eyes. He didn't bother hiding his fear this time. This time, his efforts were rewarded. Gray and turquoise slivers peeked out from Todoroki's eyelids. His gaze was dull and unfocused, and Aizawa couldn't have been happier to see it. Todoroki, can you hear me? Are you okay? A dumb question, to be sure, but he needed something to try to catch the kid's attention. It didn't seem to be working. At all. Todoroki's head swiveled to the side, watching his house burn. The fire danced in his lazy eyes. He truly seemed fascinated by it, until he started trying to fight his way out of his teacher's grasp. A weak, shaky hand reached out towards the blaze. Aizawa held tight, though, with increasing difficulty as his student fought more and more. Todoroki, what are you doing? Stop struggling, you'll hurt yourself more. His demand went unnoticed as Todoroki continued to fight. What didn't go unnoticed was how much harder he seemed to be breathing. A slight wheeze was present under the heavy gasps. Todoro, Shudo, why are you fighting? It's okay. Sister? My sister. Inside. God damn it. And then Todoroki went limp. Double damn. Heart skipping a beat, Aizawa felt for a pulse. The beat, albeit weaker than it should have been, reassured him enough to take his own breath. He put a hand in front of the face. At least he was breathing. For the first time in a while, Aizawa looked up to see the chaos around him. The fire department and water heroes worked diligently to tame the fire that refused to quit. He couldn't see Endeavor anywhere. One problem at a time. Present Mike. The voice hero who had been rushing by stopped immediately, questions on his tongue. We need someone in there, his sister is still inside. Aizawa cut him off before his friend even had the chance to speak. Wait, are you serious? Damn it, Mike, just do it. And get a medic over here right now. Present Mike didn't need to be told again. Before long, he ran off for help. All right, 2 problems taken care of. All that was left accounted for was Shudo. Endeavor. Give him back to me. Endeavor threw officers aside like ragdolls. None a match for his power. He stalked his way closer to Todoroki. The ground practically shook with his every step. Aizawa stood, laying Todoroki to the ground. He stood his ground in front of him. He needed to protect a student. His student. He would protect him no matter the villain. First things first, he needed to get him away from Todoroki. A flash of his quirk, and Endeavor's fire extinguished. With a flick of his wrist, Aizawa's scarf wrapped around his torso. Nothing was stopping him though. Through the binding, Endeavor kept barreling ahead. If he got any closer, Todoroki would be in the line of fire, so Aizawa charged forward to meet his opponent. He knew he could never beat the man in a one-on-one. Endeavor has him beat in terms of physical power. But Aizawa was faster, lighter, more agile. He ducked and weaved around the man, taking advantage of his rage-blinded mind. Any tact Endeavor normally had been thrown out the window. Endeavor blindly kicked out at the underground hero, all while Aizawa led him further away from Todoroki. And closer to midnight. Hold your breath. She warned before releasing her quirk. The mist hit Endeavor right in the face. He was down in an instant. Aizawa proceeded to secure the guaranteed former, #1 hero. He refused to let the man out of his sight until he was in the authorities' hands. With Endeavor gone, Aizawa could breathe much easier. And now he could focus on something far more important. When he looked back to where he left his student, he saw Todoroki with present Mike and paramedics being loaded into an ambulance. There was nothing he could do but wait. He protected his student the best he could, now it was in someone else's hands. Aizawa hated that part. As much as Aizawa wanted to race to the hospital immediately, he wanted to make sure Endeavor was well into police custody first. He hopped into one of the many police vehicles that littered the scene. Before they could drive away, midnight tapped on the window. Aizawa rolled down the window and wordlessly raised an eyebrow. We recovered this from the scene, she said as she handed him a cell phone. The screen was cracked and dusty. It would probably be a miracle if it even turned on. As the underground hero took the phone, Midnight grabbed onto his hand. Hey, it's not your fault. You did everything you could, and he's still alive. Be proud of that. The words were kind. He almost thought he could believe them. Hell, Aizawa knew she was right, but how could he even think to praise this moment when so much went wrong? Sure, it could have been a lot worse, but it could have been a lot better. Slipping his hand out of hers, Aizawa mumbled something of a thanks, and then they were off. The ride to the station was filled with silence only ever broken up by the startup noise of the phone. It took longer than it should have for the device to boot up. When it finally did, the colors were glitchy and words off-center, but at least it started. Even if it wouldn't stay on for long, only 7%. There wasn't anything for Aizawa to look on or any clues, more than likely, as to what happened. Not able to resist, he opened the call history and saw his own number. He expected it, honestly. It was only logical that this would be Shudo's phone. Seeing it though, undeniable proof, made his throat close up and his mouth taste sour. There were a few other notifications. Text messages from, and the phone died. Great, Aizawa grumbled. Sir? The officer questioned. Don't worry about it. Just talking to myself. Sir, we're here. The bright lights of the precinct buzzing with activity briefly blinded Aizawa. Flashing blue and red lights and the bustle of officers made the very air feel jittery. Detective Tsukachi was already waiting at the front of the building. Aizawa walked up to him, watching as others started moving endeavor. His heavy, limp body dragged along the ground. I need you to find out what happened tonight, Tsukachi, Aizawa said, his voice wavering dangerously close to pleading. Don't worry, it's our top priority. And the media won't be getting their hands on this, Tsukachi replied. Everything about him, his posture, the cold, steely gaze in his eyes, said he would make good on his word. The number one. Hero's house goes up in flames? The media'll be all over that. Damn vultures. They're going to be pretty insistent. The detective scoffed. They can insist all they want, but they're not getting anywhere near this case. That's a promise. I'll hold you to it. Aizawa stayed there until he saw Endeavor locked up and secured. He almost wanted to stay. See Endeavor wake up and get the answers out of the man himself. He wanted to know why he did it, hear it from his own lips. But even more so, Aizawa wanted to be there for Todoroki. He didn't care that Yamada would be there when the kid woke. Todoroki was his student, his responsibility, and god damn it, he wanted to be there when that kid opened his eyes with clarity. He wanted to reassure him that, even though it wasn't right now, it would be okay. He would make it okay. That's why Aizawa became a hero. Declining the police escort, Aizawa started walking. No sense in rushing. Judging by the wounds that kid was sporting, he doubted he would even be able to see him for a while. So he walked in the brisk night air. Or early morning air, he supposed. Let the lights and few cars drown out and distract him. Not that it really worked. His mind raced with 1,000 worries and thoughts, and nothing could get his mind off it no matter how much he wanted it to. It took a little over an hour to walk to the hospital. When he walked through the sliding glass door, the sterile scent of antiseptic smacked Aizawa in the face. He was getting real tired of that smell. He spotted Yamada quickly in the waiting room. Honestly, the man stuck out like a sore thumb, still dressed in his hero costume, and flopped down into the chair next to him. God, he was tired. Yamada, for his part, tried to keep the mood light. The small smile on his face pulled sadly on his lips. If he could smile, at least that meant it couldn't be too bad. Aizawa hoped. He was about to say something when the blonde cut him off. First and foremost, Todoroki is okay. He's in surgery now. What? How is that okay? The woman working the reception desk gave them a scathing look. Aizawa couldn't care less about that right now. His student was in surgery, again. The second this mess was over, he was putting every single one of his problem children under house arrest. Okay, I probably should have eased into that more, Yamada tried placating. Aizawa was so concerned, he couldn't even enjoy how flustered his friend was. You think? The underground hero cried. Yamada held his hands up in surrender and said, I'm sorry, geez. He's stable. I should have said they told me he's stable. And they've got recovery girl coming in soon. He's in good hands, so you should try to relax. How can I relax at a time like this? Aizawa snapped. The few others in the waiting room with them were starting to stare. And the receptionist looked even more done than before. I never thought I'd be the one saying this to you, but you need to quiet down, Zawa. If looks could kill, Yamada's face would melt into a puddle that would be curb-stomped repeatedly. Ugh, and the worst part was Aizawa knew he was right. He would never admit it though. He didn't need to inflate Yamada's ego any more than it already was. Aizawa scrubbed a weary hand down his face. A heavy, bone-tired sigh escaped his lips. He felt Yamada's hand rest on his back and the familiarity of the situation didn't escape him. Maybe you should go home for a while. Get changed, clean up. There's nothing you can do right now, the voice hero suggested, his voice a special kind of soft specially reserved for his friend. No, Aizawa said with a shake of his head. No, I'm staying here. Yamada didn't even try to argue. So, they sat in silence, both just enjoying the other's company. If the circumstances were different, it would have been nice. Hours passed before there was any sort of development, but not in any way either hero could have expected. A towering young man with hair as white as snow came running through the doors and right up to the receptionist's desk. His eyes darted frantically, and his words were rushed out when he spoke. Are my sister and brother here? Shudo didn't know what was happening. He couldn't feel anything. Except confusion, he supposed, though he didn't think that really counted. He vaguely remembered that something happened. Something? I wonder how long it's been since that something, he wondered. He felt floaty. Not like his usual floaty though. This was different. Like being sleepy and almost awake all at the same time. It was honestly pretty nice. So worryless and relaxed. I wonder how long this will last. Is this forever now? Maybe this is what death feels like? I hope not. There were still some things I never got to try. Never been to a party before. Never got to become the hero I wanted to be. I don't think there's anything I can do if this is death. That's a shame. Shudo didn't think much about that anymore. No point in it really, he couldn't change anything. So, he just embraced it. He let the warmth and darkness drag him down into a comfortable quiet place. The next time he became remotely aware of his surroundings, it was not nearly as pleasant. He felt far more. An ache that went deep down into his bones and veins. His entire body felt like it was made of cotton. So tired even though he just woke up, maybe. Was he awake? Ugh, he didn't even know. Something rested on his face. Hey, he could feel his face again. What on earth was that? Shudo reached a lazy hand up the thing. Smooth and plastic. Why? It was kind of annoying. He tried to pull the darn thing off, but something wrapped around his hand. So warm. That was nice. There was a certain dead tired amusement in that voice. No kid, don't mess with that. You need it, alright? Does he really? It was annoying and he'd prefer it off, thank you very much. Shudo tried to express his disapproval, all he did was make quite the pitiful groan. Just relax. Someone pushed his hair off his forehead. Relax? He supposed he could do that. Especially with whoever that was. Despite his obvious disdain for the infernal whatever it was, Shudo let his hand be removed without argument. It's not like he really could if he wanted to. Shudo sighed, sinking even deeper into the foggy haze. Just relax. The third time around, Shudo well and truly woke up. It took forever, at least it felt like forever, to pry open his heavy eyelids, and the second he did the harsh, bright lights stabbed his very brain. Something flimsy and a little scratchy covered his body, while something else so soft, softer than he was used to, cradled him. A beeping in the background, how did he not notice that before? Picked up its shrill pace, which did nothing to help his head. God, it felt like someone was squeezing his head. The cacophony assaulting his senses forced his eyes to snap shut. He didn't even care if he was whimpering like an injured pup. He turned his face into the pillow cradling his head, hoping to escape the room's torment. A large hand rested on the side of his head, and for a moment Shudo's heart skipped a beat. But then a voice, not as familiar as it should have been, spoke gently to him. It's good to see you awake, little bro, Natsuo said sitting on the bed right by Shudo's side. There were tears in his eyes and a watery smile on his face. He ran his fingers through Shudo's hair, tucking stray strands and rubbing his thumb over his temple. Shudo wouldn't even pretend that he didn't lean into the touch. He and Natsuo had never been that close, closer now since everything with Endeavor, and no one, except for their mother, had ever done something like this. Right now, he couldn't care less. He opened his mouth, trying to ask a question, express his appreciation, something. All he managed was a painful croak that tore at his throat and made him cough. And not a light, polite cough, oh no. This was a chest-heaving, breath-stealing full-body hack. His body folded in on itself as Shudo tried to draw in a full breath that refused to come. If he thought his body was sore before, it was on fire. No, not fire. Oh, it was god-awful. He felt nauseous with the pain. His hand clawed desperately at his throat, feeling scratchy gauze under his fingers. Natsuo put his arm around his brother, practically the only thing holding him up. Under his arm, he felt the muscles spasm. He grabbed at the cup of water on the bedside table and brought it to Shudo's lips. I know it's going to be hard, but try to take sips of this, okay? It took an embarrassingly long time, and more than one embarrassing spit take, to take a proper drink. Eventually, Shudo could breathe again and really appreciate the soothing coolness of the water. Geez, slow down or you'll just start coughing again, the older Todoroki chided, taking the water away from his brother. There will be plenty of water, don't worry. Shudo glared at the young man, though it had about as much ferocity as a newborn puppy. Natsuo just ruffled his hair with a smile, much brighter than his previous one. What happened? The hero in training's voice was rough like sandpaper and felt like he swallowed some too. Before Natsuo could respond, someone from the doorway said, I was hoping you could tell us. Both brothers turned to find Aizawa, scruffy as ever, leaning against the doorframe. The bags under his eyes looked even heavier, darker. The man sauntered into the room to sit in the chair by the bed. He was slouched back in the chair that would seem relaxed, but to Shudo, his student, he could tell the hero was tense. He never liked when adults looked that way, especially when they asked questions like this. All eyes were on the two-toned hair boy, eagerly awaiting an answer, some sort of explanation. That was harder than he cared to admit. The whole event lay in a fog, so close and yet indistinguishable. There was one thing that shined terrifyingly bright inside the fog. Endeavor. Shudo swallowed thickly against the sick feeling rising in his throat. He couldn't say it, he couldn't. Oh crap, what was he supposed to do? It had been ingrained into his life, his soul to never speak a word about what happened inside his house. Wait, but that's how it used to be. That was before. Now, he shouldn't need to, that wasn't the rule anymore, right? Or would it be worse to say something now? Did it even matter? But he needs to answer, he was asked a question. The world swam and tilted in front of his eyes. Closing his eyes, Shudo dropped his head into his hands. He heard the sheets shift as Natsuo scooted closer. He softly murmured instructions to breathe deeply and rubbed his back comfortingly. Couldn't they just leave him alone and let him forget this ever happened? Shudo felt Aizawa rest his calloused hand on his leg. Todoroki. He didn't bother looking up. He didn't think Aizawa was really asking him to. Trying to show his teacher some respect, he turned his head ever so slightly to show that he was listening. You're safe here, kid. No one, and I mean no one, will hold you responsible. No one will hurt you. You are well and truly safe. You already know what happened better than I do, so why do I need to say it? Shudo begged to know. And it was true. He didn't remember what happened, not really. Aizawa sighed. You'll have to tell the police all that you know anyways. I thought you might like to discuss it prior to their arrival. In case there was anything else you might want to tell them. That sounded implicit. Shudo groaned, I really don't remember. I know I came home and there was fire and the hero in training trailed off. There was a thought pushing its way to the top of his mind, urgent and desperate. Staring into his hands, he chased after the thought. Todoroki? Sho? The second he realized what he'd been missing, it hit Shudo like a freight train. Natsuo had to move out the way, he reacted so violently. God damn it, Fumi. Shudo flailed, tossing the blanket aside. The machine started screaming as he pushed his way off the bed, detaching his fore and heart monitor, and would have fallen right onto the cold, hard tile floor if not for Aizawa's hero-honed instincts. "Geez, kid, what were you thinking?" Any anger in the underground hero's voice was the result of his near-heart attack from having to catch his injured student. And here he thought the kid wouldn't be able to get into trouble in a hospital. "Is she okay? Where is she?" "Shudo, you need to calm down before you hurt yourself," Natsuo said. He would have preferred to comfort his brother, but he needed to silence the machines. There was no stopping any nurses from coming in now, so at least he could assure them their patient wasn't dying. Aizawa kept a firm but gentle grip on his student. Thankfully, it wasn't too difficult. "Todoroki, we can take you to her, but in your condition, you're not getting anywhere on your own. Be rational, hold still, and let us help you." For the first time since waking up, Shudo really stopped and took a look at the state of himself. Under the hospital garment, he could feel gauze wrapped around what he definitely remembered to be a painful burn. He recalled the wrappings on his throat, and more on his right arm. Reaching for his face, he felt bandages and even a few stitches. Higher up, there was even more bandages wrapped around his head. What truly floored him, no pun intended, was the pristine white cast that covered his right leg from the knee down. Seriously, how the hell did he not notice that? Maybe, whatever drugs he'd been put on were better than he thought. Shudo felt his stomach roll. Okay, maybe they weren't that good. This time, there was no stopping the rising, bubbling nausea. And he'd really rather not vomit on his teacher. He wants to keep some of his dignity intact if he can help it. He grabbed at his teacher's arm, fingers digging into the skin. Opening his mouth was a terrible idea. The pooling saliva could tell him that. He hoped the man would understand what it meant, when Shudo put a trembling hand over his mouth. The teen had never been so grateful than when Aizawa shifted him so that he leaned to the side. Hot humiliation ran through his body along with frame-racking shivers. His stomach convulsed and soon he was vomiting all over the floor. If he thought his throat hurt before, this was literal hell. The acid burned, and he knew a lot about burning, and the smell made everything worse. His head felt ready to explode, and he was ready to join it. And if he didn't realize the wound on his side before, he really did now. Every time he heaved, the wound pulled as if begging for his attention. Newsflash, he was a bit preoccupied. Shudo gagged and spat onto the floor. He already felt disgusting, so he might as well go all the way. Sweat soaked into his clothes and only made his shivering worse. He briefly considered trying to regulate his temperature, but quickly changed his mind when barely calling upon his quirk caused his everything to ache. "Todoroki, do you think you'll be okay to be moved?" The boy in question didn't really have an answer. Didn't want to answer, a recurring theme for him today. Once again, instead of answering, he let his actions do his talking. What they were saying he had no idea. So, Shudo just leaned back, letting his body go limp against his teacher. He refused to open his eyes. Around him there was a flurry of action. Shudo was picked up and put back on the bed. A prick in his arm told him his fore had been replaced. The faint citrus smell in the air must have meant his mess had been cleaned up. No, he'd rather not watch all that. It wasn't until someone tapped his good leg that Shudo opened his eyes. Natsuo stared back at him, perched again on the bed, with a look somewhere between sympathy, pity, and frustration. If some of his classmates are to be believed, that's what little brothers are supposed to make their older brothers look like. At least he's done something right today. "Shudo, if you ever do that again, I'm going to land you in the hospital myself," Natsuo threatened, handing his brother the cup of water that was truly becoming the MVP today. Aizawa chimed in from the chair with a tired, "I second that. Please. I need to see her," Shudo croaked. But his voice sounds egregious. It sounded like he smoked gravel and destitution. "Todoroki, you have an impressive concussion. I don't need to think to see her. Your body is battered and bruised to hell and back. And the second, bordering on third-degree burn on your side. I can hold still. Kid, you have a broken leg?" The underground hero pinched the bridge of his nose. Shudo persisted, "I can use crutches." "You definitely will not be doing that," Natsuo objected. He couldn't do a lot of things for Shudo, but he could at least make sure he didn't kill himself in a crutch-related accident. Aizawa sighed, deep from within his perpetually exhausted soul. You're not going to let this go anytime soon, are you? If you don't take me, I'll take myself. Regardless of his weakened state, Shuto spoke with all the conviction of a real hero. Aizawa leaned forward and looked the hero in training dead in his eyes. You can go see her, if and only if you use a wheelchair and your brother allows it. Natsuo? Shuto was by no means known for his facial emotion, but he poured every ounce of desperation and hope into his face. Please? Despite being larger than life, Natsuo looked so small and conflicted in that moment. He chewed his lip, running a hand through his hair. His eyes grew misty, voice a little choked as he said, "It's not good, Sho. Maybe you should wait a little longer until you're doing better." The teenager shook his head, and boy, that was a mistake, but he tried not to let it show. No, that's why it has to be now. I can handle it. No words, Natsuo only nodded, and that's all it took. Soon, a wheelchair was brought in and Shuto, four in all, was being packed into it. Natsuo pushed the way while Aizawa hung back. Down the bustling hallways they went past nurses' stations, waiting families, and hustling doctors. There wasn't a single space that went unused or wasn't teeming with activity. Sitting in that wheelchair, surrounded by all the activity, made Shuto feel weak and lazy. Lazing around like some civilian when you should be doing something productive. Anything. Endeavor. He would have preferred not remembering that. In truth, he'd probably prefer not to remember anything from that night. Maybe the memories would stay away forever. Then he'd never have to know, never have to answer. So lost in thought, Shuto barely noticed that they'd finally stopped in front of a door, in the burn ward. Natsuo put a hand on his brother's shoulder and gently squeezed. Are you ready? It was Shuto's turn to only nod. The door was pushed open. For a brief moment, the teenager got hit with a strange sense of déjà vu. The light of the window silhouetted a white-haired woman sat up on a hospital bed. Slowly, for the first time in a while, the Todoroki family reunited. If only it were under better circumstances. When Fumi faced her brothers, Shuto found himself lost in a whirlwind of emotions. Sorrow, guilt, and most of all blind rage. Fumi had well and truly been burned. Her body was wrapped in bandages from head to toe, no appendage being spared. From what Shuto could see, bandages wrapped around from both her arms, creeping up her neck and onto the side of her face. The little bit of skin peeking out from the wrappings were white and waxy looking. Oh no! Not even her hair had been spared. One side of her hair was obviously shorter than the other and charred black on the edges. When her eyes landed on Shuto, regardless of her injuries, Fumi smiled. So, every syllable out of her mouth sounded like pure struggle. The youngest Todoroki was wheeled to the bed, Fumi immediately reaching out to him. Even though she didn't reach out with it, Shuto could see that her wounded arm shook and trembled. The blanket covering her legs slightly shook. Least one of her legs must have been burned too, he noted. Shuto let his sister caress his face, feeling no instinctual urge to pull away. Gingerly, afraid to somehow worsen her condition, he touched her hand. He couldn't look her in the eyes. I'm sorry. Fumi's eyebrows knitted together in confusion. I shouldn't have left you behind. I could have warned you or distracted him. A delicate finger tapping his nose silenced his rant. Fumi shook her head, white hair swishing around her head. No, it was your fault. After all the years of defending and holding out for the man she called father, Fumi couldn't say it. It would be like her entire family goal was a lie. Like admitting she was wrong. That he was wrong. Doesn't Ven H. Ert. And she punctuated her sentence with one more tap on his nose and a sharp cough. Natsuo, who had hung back allowing his siblings their moment, moved forward. Take it easy, sis. You probably shouldn't talk anymore. She coughed once more and smirked. Lil bro, the affronted look on Natsuo's face said it all. Really? It would seem older sisters didn't like being bossed around by little brothers. Shuto, why don't you go back to your room and get some rest? You look like you need it, the middle Todoroki suggested, though it sounded much more like a requirement. He supposed no matter how hard he tried to hide it, Shudo couldn't mask his exhaustion. Well, he'd felt exhausted before following his little vomiting episode, now he truly wanted to pass out. He looked to his sister for her input, and of course she smiled sweetly and nodded. She did have a lot of experience with him at his worst, what with training and all. I'll come visit you later, Fumi. I promise. Natsuo, you should stay here for a while. Are you sure, Sho? I'm sure. Someone's got to keep our sister company. The Todoroki sister took her brother's hand and put it to her own face. She leaned into the touch, pressing a little kiss onto his palm. I love you too, Shudo responded. He wished he could blame the quiver in his voice on his injuries. It was then that Aizawa truly walked into the room, taking hold of his student's wheelchair. He nodded in acknowledgement to the other Todoroki siblings. As he led Shudo out the door, Natsuo called out, "Take care of him for us." Aizawa paused long enough to tell them, "I will." As the two made it back to Shudo's room, he really felt himself deflate. He may not have needed to think to visit Fumi, but that doesn't mean it helped his headache at all. Not to mention, sitting up for so long had left his side feeling itchy, achy, and all around uncomfortable. The feeling left him squirming in the seat, trying to find a comfortable position, but only serving to aggravate his other wounds. He barely held in the sigh of relief when they arrived back to his room. He offered no arguments when Aizawa helped him into bed. Sinking into the mattress, wow, he never thought he'd enjoy something other than a futon so much. He allowed his teacher to pull the blankets over him. In the silence of the room, Aizawa sat back in that chair and quietly asked, "Do you still want to know what happened?" The response was immediate. "Yes." "Are you sure? There's no rush. You can rest some beforehand. You've been through quite a lot." "Yes." Blunt as ever. He wanted to know sooner rather than later. "All right. Before I tell you, I just want to know what you remember." This again. Shudo drew in a deep breath. Well, as deep as he could get. "I really don't remember much. I remember coming home and then something. Then father. Hindev, something to do with training." This was starting to make his head hurt. I think he wanted to train, or thought I wasn't training enough. Then I remember fire and I remember calling you. But that's it. I'm sorry, sir, I don't think I can recall anything else. That's okay, Todoroki. You did just fine. It was Aizawa's turn to draw in a deep breath. From what the police and Detective Tsukachi himself gathered, Endeavor had been hit by a quirk on his latest mission. A quirk, sir? It looked like every word physically pained Aizawa to say. Yes. An aggression quirk that causes an increase in adrenaline, testosterone, and cortisol, which makes those affected by it to feel angry and aggressive. In the case of Endeavor, he lashed out at you. In his interrogation, he himself confirmed that he was blinded by an inexplicable rage and his senses and judgment were dulled as a result. So, Shudo started hesitantly, it wasn't his fault? Aizawa visibly flinched. His head fell back before he pushed himself up and started pacing the room. Technically, no. There were measures he could have taken the second something was amiss for the sake of his family's safety. That made sense. Much more sense than Endeavor suddenly changing his entire moral code. Though, Shudo supposed he kind of did that already. It wasn't Endeavor's fault. Or at least not entirely. He couldn't decide if that made it better or worse. Maybe it was the pure weariness flooding his body, maybe the painkillers that filled his system, or maybe it was just the overwhelming emotion he still felt, but Shudo found himself telling the hero things he never would have said. I thought I might have been able to forgive him before. I wanted to see what he would do, who he would become. But now, Aizawa waited patiently, letting his student find the words. I don't think I can forgive him for what he did. It reminded me of every little thing that he had done, and I don't think I can do it anymore. Not after what he did to my mother, to Fumi and Natsuo. And you don't have to, the underground hero affirmed. The man seemed to stall suddenly. Gears were turning in his head, Shudo could tell. Tilting his head, Aizawa studied his student. What about you? The teacher ended up asking. Sir? What about you? You said what he did to your mother and your siblings, but what about you? That drew Shudo up short. What kind of question was that? Nevertheless, he answered this time, confident in his answer. I'm going to be a hero, and I've been trained to take a beating. Fumi, my mother? They were never supposed to experience this. I can admit, Endeavor was harsher than usual, but it's nothing I haven't dealt with before. I can hold my own. The room fell deathly silent. Aizawa halted all movement. Shuda wasn't even sure the man was breathing. His gaze became hard and steely, shoulders drawn up, and fists clenched. Todoroki, Aizawa said through gritted teeth, I'm going to need you to elaborate on that statement. Specifically, the part where you said you've been trained to take a beating, nothing you haven't dealt with before, and harsher than usual. Aizawa had been in many awkward and uncomfortable situations. He'd been to karaoke with Namuri when she got way too into it. He'd been there when some poor unfortunate soul brought up experimentation around Principal Nedzu. For crying out loud, he'd had to meet every single one of his students' parents and convince them to move their kids into the dorms. But never had he been through anything more awkward and uncomfortable than sitting in a waiting room with Todoroki Natsuo, a brother he barely knew his student even had. For 10 hours no less. Yamada, Natsuo, and Aizawa were left to sit in the disgustingly white and sterile environment waiting room in plastic chairs that were certainly a regrettable decision. There was nothing to talk about, not a word to be said. When Aizawa had approached the frantic young man, it had been hard enough to tear his attention away from the nurse's desk. Are you Todoroki's brother? That got his attention real fast. Do you know my brother? Is he okay? I saw there was a fire at the house on the news, and this is the 3rd hospital I've been trying to find them. Is my sister here? Do you know what happened? I'm his homeroom teacher, Aizawa interrupted. Take a breath before you pass out. Geez, you're as bad as my students? Natsuo looked floored, and barely recovered enough to say, I'm Todoroki Natsuo. Are my siblings here? Are they okay? The pleading in his voice cut Aizawa deep. The man's eyes were wide, sweat clung to his forehead, and his breath shuddered on every intake. It hurt all the more when all the hero could tell him was, they're here, but we don't know their condition. Hardly any words were exchanged when Aizawa led the brother towards the seats. Yamada made an introduction but didn't even attempt to say anything else. Outside of that, there hadn't been a single word for the 10 hours they'd been sitting there. As the early morning dragged into the day, Aizawa started receiving more and more emails from students checking in. Polite questions concerning their classmate, his lack of response to their messages, and the fire at his house were the topic of nearly every single email. Regardless of Tsukachi's word, no one could stop the media from covering a fire at the #1 hero's house. It was only a matter of time before his students got curious. Aizawa almost responded. Almost. But he couldn't bring himself to say anything yet. He couldn't tell them about the situation. It was sensitive material and need to know for most pro-heroes. And he didn't have an update on Todoroki's condition. Telling them anything would feel like lying to them or just another slap in the face with uncertainty. Aizawa couldn't do that to them. His students have been through far too much. The least he could do is be absolutely positive with whatever news he has to tell them. At one point, Natsuo looked as if he wanted to say something, an increasingly misty look growing in his eyes, but instead chose to sit and ruminate. Until now. So, do you know what happened? Natsuo sniffled. Aizawa didn't want to answer that. By God, he really didn't want to answer that. It would be much easier if he didn't know a single damn detail. Then he wouldn't have to acknowledge his own shortcomings. But he couldn't very well lie to the man. Yes. I do. And Aizawa proceeded to tell him everything. Everything he knew at least. As the story unfolded, Natsuo's face went through several emotions. Fear, horror, rage, devastation. Those last two stuck around the longest. There was also recognition? That didn't make any sense. Does he know something? Aizawa thought. Before he had the chance to question the matter, a familiar woman in a lab coat and scrubs approached them, gray hair in a bun and cane hobbling along. Recovery girl. Her face gave nothing away. Aizawa didn't know if that was a good thing. All three men stood up, only for Recovery girl to gesture for them to sit again. She looked Natsuo up and down, then asked, Before I begin, this is a sensitive situation and we can't let just anyone know, so I need to know who you are. Aizawa figured the woman gathered the information for herself but needed that confirmation. A true professional when she wanted to be. I'm Shudo's brother, Natsuo. The man in question practically wasn't breathing at this point. I know you've been waiting for a long time, so I'll get straight to the point. Shudo is fine. At least he will be. It was as if the world had been lifted off their shoulders. Natsuo slumped forward, head falling into his hands. Yamada fell back in his seat, laughing softly with tears in his eyes. Aizawa, as always, kept his composure. On the outside he remained collected, but on the inside he was crying with relief. Recovery Girl gave them a moment of pause to soak in the information before continuing. Yes, Shudo is going to be fine, but it will take a lot of work. This definitely took a toll on the boy. It's going to take a lot of work to get back to where he was. And not just physically, she said with a serious look. I won't sugarcoat it, things are looking pretty rough right now. There's a serious burn on his side and his arms got a nasty bruise. Lacerations and bruises all over and swelling all around his throat. It had been so bad at one point that he couldn't breathe at one point. Recover Girl's voice grew tight, her eyes misty. She loved every UA student and seeing them in such a state broke her heart every time. There's the concussion that caused us quite a few troubles. And his leg, it's truly well and broken. Given how exhausted he was, I couldn't do much with my quirk. I'll spare you the details of all the work that needed to be done, but it was extensive. Natsuo had grown increasingly fidgety as the healing hero spoke. Crossing and uncrossing his legs, running a hand through his hair, and shifting in his seat, the man could not sit still. Tears flowed freely down his face, but he didn't really seem to notice or care at all. It killed Aizawa to watch his struggle. Every instinct he had screamed at him to reassure, make the situation better. He couldn't though. He didn't know Natsuo personally, trying to help him would feel like a violation. Nothing he said or did would make this any better. And he thought he felt helpless before. Aizawa had never excelled when it came to the comforting aspect of hero work, unlike Yamada. The voice hero already had a hand on the Todoroki son's back. He could make even the most hopeless soul smile. See, can I see Shudo? Natsuo asked. He tried futilely to dry his eyes, but the tears kept coming. Recovery Girl's face softened even more. I'm sorry, dearie, but not quite yet. He's in post-op recovery at the moment. It'll be at least 45 minutes before he can see any visitors. The old woman took Natsuo's hand in hers. The second you're allowed to, I'll let you know. And my sister, Fumi? Do you have any news on her? No, I'm afraid not yet. When I know something... Yes, thank you, Natsuo interrupted. Regardless of the rudeness, Recovery Girl didn't seem to mind. She just patted his knee and went back down into the halls of the hospital. As soon as she left, the white-haired man lost any remaining composure he had. Yamada was quick to console him, while Aizawa received an ill-timed phone call. Walking away from the scene, he took one look at the caller ID and knew he was in for a rough conversation. What can I do for you, Nedzu? How are you holding up? Aizawa said, rubbing a hand down his face, as well as I can be. Now, why did you really call? Endeavor's awake now. That was news. Nedzu continued. They confirmed that it was indeed Endeavor and not the result of a quirk. I thought you'd like to know that Detective Tsukachi will be starting the interrogation soon. Oh, how Aizawa wanted to be there. He wanted to know what was going through Endeavor's head when he beat his own child. He wanted to know what excuse that man could come up with to justify his actions. And yet, I can't leave my student. I had a feeling you'd say that. How is Todoroki? He's alive, in post-recovery now. He's going to have a lot of rehabilitation ahead of him. No. There's no news on his sister yet. Sometimes no news is good news, the principal hummed. Silence fell over the conversation, neither sure what to say. Nedzu finally said, this won't be an easy situation to handle. The media will be at our throats, talk will be all over the school. For once the principal wasn't long-winded. He was blunt, quick to the point. It really showed how much he was affected. Aizawa almost wished he were beating around the bush as usual. This won't be easy time, for anyone. UA, society, you, and especially the Todoroki family. I'll keep you posted on any updates we receive. I hope you'll do the same. Of course. Aizawa hung up and replaced his phone into his pocket, feeling the other phone that rested inside. He had borrowed Yamada's charger to hopefully bring life back into Todoroki's. He hadn't felt courageous enough to look at it. That, and the second there was any news, he wanted to be able to drop everything. Going back to the waiting room, things had calmed down. Granted, it was almost entirely because Yamada had convinced Natsuo to go outside and get some fresh air, but a win is a win. Who was that? Yamada asked as his friend sat down. Nedzu. He told me Endeavor is awake and Tsukachi's going to start questioning the bastard soon. To his credit, Yamada didn't react too much. He remained composed, only taking a deep breath to calm himself down. Do you want me to go for you? What? And here Aizawa thought nothing else could surprise him today. I know you don't want to leave, and I know you want answers. I'll go in your place and tell you what that pathetic excuse for a hero and father has to say for himself. Todoroki's your student too. I can't ask you to do that. Yes, you can. I know you'd do the same for Aizawa. It's what friends are for, the voice hero assured, standing from his seat. His back popped as he stretched, starting to walk away. Make sure you eat and drink something, take a shower or something. And don't worry, I'll take care of May. Now if you'll excuse me, there's an asshole that I need to watch crash and burn. Pun very much intended. Aizawa refused to laugh at that. No, not even a chuckle. Once his coworker and friend left, it was all back to waiting again. Natsuo resurfaced eventually, looking marginally better than before and holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Aizawa, bless his soul, which he gladly started downing. Bitter, old, and caffeinated, and that's good enough for him. For another hour the two waited. A whole goddamn hour Aizawa couldn't see his student, was forced to stare at those emails with nothing to say. It was torture. Finally, a nurse walked out to lead them to Todoroki's room. Natsuo didn't hesitate to burst into the room. He didn't stop until he was pulled up in a chair next to his brother's side. He took his brother's hand with such care, as if he were scared to hurt him more. And Aizawa couldn't blame him. Working as a hero, he had seen a lot of injuries over the years. He had seen a lot of students injured. The only time he had ever seen a student in this bad of shape was with Midoriya. And that was largely the result of his own quirk. This was the result of a hero. Aizawa slowly joined Natsuo in the room, taking in the scene before him and a seat. Todoroki laid so still on the bed. An oxygen mask rested on his face, bandages covering his skin. The white sheet surrounding him nearly matched his skin. Todoroki had always been pretty pale, but he was bordering on ghost, making his scar stand out like a blood stain. The kid almost looked peaceful in this state. It was certainly the most relaxed Aizawa had ever seen him. How terrible was that? Time didn't matter anymore. As the two men sat there, time simultaneously sped by and crawled past. The occasional nurse would walk in to check on the kid, but other than that the room was still. All eyes on the steady rise and fall of Todoroki's chest. You know, Shudo and I were never very close? Natsuo suddenly said. He rubbed a gentle finger across his brother's cheek, eyes completely distant. I didn't get to see him very often and actually interacted with him even less. I love my brother, but as terrible as it sounds, I never thought I'd really feel anything towards him than instinctual, obligatory sibling love. As time went on and, well, shit kept happening, we got closer. I guess I just never expected to be this scared and worried for someone I barely know. Family has a strange way of doing that, Aizawa said. He didn't mention that he wasn't in contact with his family anymore. That didn't matter though, because he had a family he found all on his own. Yamada, Eri, Nemuri, he would do anything for them. Natsuo chuckled. Yeah, they really do. That night they both slept in the room with Natsuo's head resting on Shudo's bed, while Aizawa slumped in his chair. Not the most comfortable position to sleep in, but not the worst. And, most importantly, it kept him close to his student. Yamada had sent him a text late at night, telling him the interrogation was over. He refused to say more though. He actually insisted that Aizawa sleep instead. Not the best way to try to get him to sleep. The anticipation was driving him crazy, But after the exhausting day he had, sleep wasn't as far off as it usually was. Sadly, that didn't stop him from waking up the moment the sun came up. And even worse, nothing had changed. Or maybe that was a good thing. Like Netsu said, no news is good news. Aizawa stretched, bones popping, and stood. He needed a coffee? Or 5. He really needed caffeine. He didn't even care in what form. When he got back to the room after his caffeine run, he had already downed 5 cups, working on his 6th, and a nurse was just leaving. Natsuo stood in the middle of the room, conflict stewing in his features. They said I can see Fumi now. But I don't want Shudo to be alone. Just go. I had no intention of leaving. He didn't need anything more. Natsuo practically ran out the door and into the halls. How hard it must be to have to choose between his own siblings. Aizawa couldn't even imagine. Sitting there in his student's hospital room with nothing to do but listen to the constant beeping of a heart monitor was really starting to get to him. He could feel the illogical guilt weighing down on him, all the what-ifs swarming his head. This was just as bad as being trapped in a nightmare. Except he couldn't wake up from this. He didn't know how much time passed when his phone rang again. Not a moment was wasted when he saw who it was. You better have some fantastic news for me. Geez, you could at least say hello first or something, Yamada replied. I will hang you upside down from the ceiling in your sleep. You're not going to like it? I already hate it, so, Yamada, will you just tell me? Endeavor's innocent. No. There must have been a mistake. There's no way that man is innocent. Aizawa had been there, he had seen the result of Endeavor's wrath. He was still seeing it here in the hospital. Through gritted teeth, the underground hero poured all his rage into one single word. What? Yamada sighed. Apparently, Endeavor had been on an assignment where some criminal had hit him with her quirk called aggression. It's a mist that causes an increase in hormones like testosterone, cortisol, and adrenaline in the victim, which results in serious rage. Are you serious? His children happened to be in the way when he rampaged. Both Endeavor and the villain attested to his impairment. Tsukachi also confirmed they were telling the truth. Somebody needed to check him into the hospital soon, because Aizawa swore he was having a heart attack. He couldn't believe what he heard. So, what that fucker gets away unpunished while his children are left to suffer? There's not much that can be done if it was the result of a quirk, Yamada reasoned. He sounded so tired, so done. Aizawa didn't mean to unload on him like this, but what the hell? There, of course, were actions he could have taken to prevent the entire incident, but it's just one of those things. I know, I hate it too. But you've got to look at the bright side. He didn't attack his children for the hell of it. Aizawa scoffed. Yes, because that makes parental assault so much better. Really, Father of the Year. You know what I meant, Yamada sighed again. There's nothing we can do but be there for the kid now. I'll take care of your report for you, so you don't have to worry about that. I'm sorry, Za. Thank you, but it's not me that needs any apology. There wasn't much to be said after that. They exchanged goodbyes, leaving Aizawa to sink back into his chair. He ran a hand through his messy dark hair. How could this be? A quirk? A fucking quirk. Endeavor gets away with this atrocity on a technicality. And worse, Aizawa knew it was right. Endeavor could not be blamed for this incident, not truly. And even worse, Aizawa almost wanted him to be responsible. How awful was that? He essentially wanted his student's father to abuse him, so the man would face consequences. And his student would be safe. Sorry, Todoroki. Looks like you can't thank me yet? Surprisingly enough, Todoroki did respond. Well, not really a response per se, but he actually moved. His arm and eyelids twitched. Leaning in, Aizawa watched as the hero in training slowly reached up and grabbed at the oxygen mask on his face. With a rather weak grasp, Todoroki tried to pull off his mask. Well, they couldn't have that regardless of how amusing it was. No, kid, don't mess with that. You need it, alright? Aizawa lightly scolded, taking hold of his student's hand. The kid groaned, fidgeting like a disgruntled puppy. To hopefully calm Todoroki down, Aizawa ran his fingers through the kid's hair. Just relax. The boy sagged into the pillow. He then pulled the hand off the mask with no resistance and put it back onto the bed. Little by little, Todoroki completely relaxed, melting onto the bed. Eventually, he fell back asleep, if he had even been awake. Then it was back to more goddamn waiting. Natsuo had returned late that Sunday, long after the sun had set. He looked even wearier than before. He explained to Aizawa Fuyumi's condition, her body covered in third-degree burns. Using skin grafts and pressure clothing, the doctors think they could minimize scarring. The nerve damage, on the other hand, well, that would be for another day. For now, they'd focus on scarring and smoke inhalation. In turn, Aizawa informed the brother of Todoroki's awakening, however brief it was, and the verdict on endeavor. The white-haired man had been silent throughout the entire recollection. At the end, all Natsuo had to say was, "Could you make sure he doesn't come and visit them? I don't think they'd want to see him right now." Aizawa didn't need to be told twice. He didn't even need a proper reason. He sent out a message to Yamada with the request, and he was happy to oblige. The night was, needless to say, another rough one. Sleep avoided them like they were the plague, which did not help with the constant exhaustion they'd felt for days. By morning's light, Aizawa was once again making a coffee run. This time he drank 7 cups but couldn't be bothered to grab another to go before he left. As he approached the room, he heard a rather unmistakable voice. One that he had been dying to hear for what felt like forever. What happened? Aizawa leaned against the doorframe. "I was hoping you could tell us." All eyes turned on him, including a pair of gray and turquoise, and if it weren't for his stoic nature, Aizawa might have cried with relief. He walked in, gaze never leaving his students, and sat down in the chair that had become his bed. As brutal as it would be, he needed a recount of what happened from the beginning. Mostly for reports and processing, but also in case they missed something. Aizawa didn't care if it wasn't technically Endeavor's fault. He would 100% guarantee there was nothing else that might have happened. Todoroki didn't look pleased by the question, or statement really. His fist clenched tight, his whole body stiff, until he dropped his head into his hands. Natsuo scooted closer and instructed him to breathe deeply. It almost worked. Aizawa rested his hand against his student's uncasted leg. "Todoroki." The boy in question turned his head slightly, and Aizawa could only assume that meant he was listening. "You're safe here, kid. No one, and I mean no one, will hold you responsible. No one will hurt you. You are well and truly safe. You already know what happened better than I do, so why do I need to say it?" Todoroki asked. A fair point. That wasn't exactly why he was trying to get the answers out of him, though. Aizawa explained, "You'll have to tell the police all that you know anyways. I thought you might like to discuss it prior to their arrival. In case there was anything else you might want to tell them. I really don't remember. I know I came home and there was fire and..." The kid suddenly trailed off. He looked into his hands as if they held the answer to the world. Given he had a concussion, the action was concerning to say the least. And apparently Natsuo thought so too. "Todoroki? Show? God damn it, Fuyumi." The room erupted into a flurry of action and noise. Machines started shouting for attention, and Todoroki was falling towards the unforgiving floor. Aizawa just managed to catch the kid before he hit. Honestly, it was his own fault for thinking one of his students could stay out of trouble in a hospital of all places. That was on him. "Geez, kid, what were you thinking? Is she okay? Where is she?" It was by no means difficult to keep hold of the boy, while his brother scolded him, but that didn't mean it wasn't stressful as hell. Aizawa didn't want to accidentally aggravate an injury. "Todoroki, we can take you to her, but in your condition, you're not getting anywhere on your own. Be rational, hold still, and let us help you." Thankfully, Todoroki listened this time. He looked himself up and down, feeling the bandages across his body. Had he really not noticed until now? Aizawa thought. Before he could even ask if they could move, Todoroki gripped his arm far too tight to be natural. This was only confirmed when the teen raised a shaking hand to cover his mouth. Aizawa leaned him over as best he could just in time for him to vomit on the floor. Man, this kid could never catch a break. Every shuddering heave of the small body under his hands felt painful. And once again, there was nothing Aizawa could do to help but hold on tight and try to keep his hair out of the way. After what seemed like way too long, Todoroki spat and leaned back, eyes closed. He somehow managed to look even paler than before. Todoroki, do you think you'll be okay to be moved? Aizawa didn't get a response. He better not start making a habit of this, so the hero lifted him up and put him back on the bed. Nurses flooded the room, one of them looking particularly annoyed. They replaced the torn-out four and cleaned up the mess in no time. It wasn't until Natsuo tapped his brother on the leg did Todoroki open his eyes again. He looked so done. Shuto, if you ever do that again, I'm going to land you in the hospital myself, Natsuo threatened. Oh, Aizawa was getting in on that. I second that, he said. Please. I need to see her, Todoroki pleaded. The underground hero winced at how scratchy and painful his student's voice sounded. He couldn't let him go in this condition. Todoroki, you have an impressive concussion. I don't need to think to see her. This kid cannot be serious. Your body is battered and bruised to hell and back. And the second, bordering on third-degree burn on your side. I can hold still. Kid, you have a broken leg? Was he seriously arguing with a student and losing? Aizawa pinched the bridge of his nose. Why are all his students so stubborn? Was there something in the water at UA? Shuto persisted. I can use crutches. This kid. You definitely will not be doing that, Natsuo objected. Thank God, at least someone had some sense. Even so, there was no way Aizawa was winning this. He could see it, Natsuo probably too. Aizawa sighed, deep from within his perpetually exhausted soul. You're not going to let this go anytime soon, are you? If you don't take me, I'll take myself. Despite how obviously improbable that would be, Todoroki had an unwavering determination in his eyes. One that shined in the eyes of heroes. Well, how could he deny that? Leaning in, Aizawa caught his student's gaze. You can go see her, if and only if you use a wheelchair and your brother allows it. As Todoroki implored his brother, Natsuo looked conflicted. More than anything, it looked like he wanted to say no, but what kind of person would it make him if he denied his brother such a request? The older brother tried to reason. It's not good, Sho. Maybe you should wait a little longer until you're doing better. The teenager shook his head. No, that's why it has to be now. I can handle it. And just like that, Todoroki was being put in a wheelchair and carted down the hallway. Natsuo pushed the way while Aizawa followed until they found themselves in the burn ward. The man could only imagine the pain that those in here were feeling. When they reached Fuyumi's room, Aizawa continued to hang back, not wanting to intrude on such an intimate moment. He stayed in the doorway, half listening to their conversation. It was a touching reunion, however shrouded by tragedy it was. Fuyumi really didn't look good. Burns everywhere, not even her hair had been spared. Damn endeavor. Aizawa's pocket buzzed. For the love of, he checked the vibrating phone, but it wasn't his own. No, it was Todoroki's. And every day since the incident, Midoriya would send an inhuman number of texts. Good on his students for camaraderie and looking out for each other, but this was pushing it. Normally, the hero would never violate his students' privacy, but maybe it would get Midoriya to shut up. It was getting increasingly more difficult to ignore the constant buzzing. Midoriya 12:08 p.m. Todoroki, you are really starting to worry me. Please respond. 12:09 p.m. Does this have to do W Endeavor? Is that why there was a fire? Did he do something? Todoroki? Aizawa narrowed his eyes at the words. And what they seemed to imply. It was almost logical to think that maybe a fire at the incendiary hero's house might be his own doing, but this went deeper. Did Midoriya know something? Extenuating circumstances. 12:12 p.m. Why would you ask if this has something to do with Endeavor? Aizawa. 3 dots popped up, indicating that Midoriya was typing. Then they disappeared. Then came back. Midoriya 12:20 p.m. Why do you have Todoroki's phone, sir? 12:21 p.m. Because I do. Why would you think Endeavor did something? Midoriya 12:23 p.m. Something happened, didn't it? That's why you have his phone. Is he okay? 12:24 p.m. Why did you ask about Endeavor? Do you know something? Midoriya didn't respond. Aizawa gritted his teeth. Saying nothing seemed a lot like an admission to what he didn't know, but he had a bad hunch. He tucked the thoughts away for now, as it seemed the siblings were wrapping up their meeting. Aizawa took the wheelchair in his hands and started wheeling his student towards the door. He stopped for a moment when he heard Natsuo call out, "Take care of him for us." "I will." He'd make sure of that. The walk back to Todoroki's room was just as uneventful as the first time. The kid didn't talk, though it was painfully obvious that he had no energy left at all. He sagged in the chair and fidgeted in discomfort. So, maybe, Aizawa picked up the pace a little. Who was going to call him out on it? In the room, Todoroki put up no fight when his teacher helped him into the bed. He honestly seemed downright grateful to be laying down again. Aizawa sat down, facing him, and asked, "Do you still want to know what happened?" The response was immediate. "Yes." "Are you sure? There's no rush. You can rest some beforehand. You've been through quite a lot. Please say no, please say no." "Yes." Lady Luck was never on Aizawa's side. "All right. Before I tell you, I just want to know what you remember," he said. Maybe this time he'd get a proper answer. Todoroki drew in a deep breath as if the next thing he had to say would be very difficult. "I really don't remember much. I remember coming home and then something. Then father. Endev, something to do with training." This was starting to make his head hurt. "I think he wanted to train, or thought I wasn't training enough. Then I remember Fire and I remember calling you. But that's it. I'm sorry, sir, I don't think I can recall anything else." The kid hadn't been kidding when he said he didn't remember much. Still, it gave him enough. "That's okay, Todoroki. You did just fine." Aizawa drew in the breath this time. He knew this would be very difficult to say. From what the police and Detective Tsukachi himself gathered, Endeavor had been hit by a quirk on his latest mission. "A quirk, sir?" Aizawa hated that this was the truth. He hated having to say it. "Yes. An aggression quirk that causes an increase in adrenaline, testosterone, and cortisol, which makes those affected by it to feel angry and aggressive. In the case of Endeavor, he lashed out at you. In his interrogation, he himself confirmed that he was blinded by an inexplicable rage and his senses and judgment were dulled as a result." So, Shudo started hesitantly, "It wasn't his fault?" Aizawa couldn't help but flinch at that. He let his head fall back before he couldn't hold still anymore and started pacing the room. Technically, no. There were measures he could have taken the second something was amiss for the sake of his family's safety. Todoroki contemplated the words. Watching the boy process hurt worse than Aizawa thought it would, though it should. It pained him to see the kid, his student, work out the explanation in his head, come to terms with it, rationalize it. Aizawa had seen it before in the people he'd saved, and he could see it now. No, kid, don't do this. Eventually, the hero in training must have sorted it all out. He told his teacher, "I thought I might have been able to forgive him before. I wanted to see what he would do, who he would become. But now, I don't think I can forgive him for what he did. It reminded me of every little thing that he had done, and I don't think I can do it anymore. Not after what he did to my mother, to Fumi." The underground hero didn't think he could put a name to how he felt hearing that. Relieved? No, he couldn't say he was relieved Todoroki didn't, have a healthy relationship with his father. Disappointed? Yeah, no, that was not it. In the end, it didn't matter too much how he felt on the matter. It was all up to Todoroki. So Aizawa reassured him, "And you don't have to." That wasn't quite right. He didn't include himself. Why wouldn't he include himself? He had definitely been wronged by the so-called hero. The exclusion was odd. "What about you?" Aizawa asked. "Sir?" Wow, Todoroki looked absolutely dumbfounded. "What about you?" He repeated. "You said what he did to your mother and your siblings, but what about you?" That confused look didn't leave the kid's face. If anything, it got worse. "I'm going to be a hero, and I've been trained to take a beating. Fumi, my mother? They were never supposed to experience this. I can admit, Endeavor was harsher than usual, but it's nothing I haven't dealt with before. I can hold my own." Aizawa froze. What did he say? He was pretty sure he stopped breathing. Did those words really just come out of his student's mouth? And he sounded so confident when he spoke, it made the hero's entire body stiffen. Fists clenched, shoulders up, Aizawa gave a very simple request. "Todoroki, I'm going to need you to elaborate on that statement. Specifically, the part where you said you've been trained to take a beating, nothing you haven't dealt with before, and harsher than usual. The combination of medication, pain, and exhaustion must have been getting to him, because it took Todoroki longer than it should have to process the request. When he did, though, it was written all over his face. His eyes widened, hands floundering in what was supposed to be a placating manner. That didn't come out right. I just meant that I want to be a hero. This sort of thing has happened and is going to happen, but none of my family ever signed up for that stuff. That hardly explains, and it definitely doesn't excuse what happened the other night. Try again. Aizawa's voice was tight with the anger he tried to keep out of his voice. He didn't want Todoroki to think it was directed towards him. Oh no, it was pointed towards someone far worse. I don't know what you mean, sir. I need you to explain what you said, Todoroki. You said you've been trained to take a beating and harsher than usual. What does that mean? Usual means that it has happened multiple times. Has it happened before, Todoroki? No. The kid's eyes darted from spot to spot, refusing to stay on one thing for too long, let alone his teacher. My father trains me is all, or he used to, that's all. Training? How innocent. Nothing added up. No, that wasn't true. Things added up. Midoriya's texts, what Natsuo said, Todoroki's word choice. The kid even recalled that Endeavor wanted to train right before the assault. It all added up, but it created a much darker narrative than the one Todoroki was telling. He needed a different approach. Aizawa sat down, trying to relax his body as much as possible. Todoroki, I'm going to ask a series of questions and I want you to answer honestly. Can you do that for me, please? If you don't want to do this right now, we can wait, but I need to ask and I need your honesty. The teen considered it, placing a hand over his eyes. He conceded with a quiet, Good, that was a start. Hopefully, that meant the kid trusted him. Aizawa wasn't quite sure where to start, though he knew he had to tread carefully. What did you and your father do during training? Mostly combat training with and without quirks. We'd also work on quirk control. Why was he training you? That information in and of itself was concerning enough. Combat training? If Todoroki's skills in class were anything to glean from, he's been training for at least a few years. To surpass All Might and become the #1 hero. Why? Why? Todoroki asked. He rubbed at his eyes and sighed, to carry on his legacy, I guess. That's the what? Todoroki, what were you going to say? Every word that came out of this kid's mouth was a nightmare. The more he talked, the worse it became. Yet Aizawa needed it, every single excruciating detail. Because if he could help his own student, get him away from a bad situation, then it would be worth it. Todoroki didn't answer for a full minute. Barely above a whisper he said, The reason I was born. Aizawa didn't even know where to start unpacking that. The kid looked like he was losing steam, so for now, he'd have to file it away for later. He needed to get to the root of the issue. When did he start training you? This time, Todoroki hesitated to answer, biting his lip. I think it started when I was around 5 years old. Push it down, Aizawa. He exhaled sharply. Did you want to train? Why does that matter? It does, so just answer the question, kid. I wanted to become a hero. You didn't answer my question, Todoroki. I asked if you wanted to train. Oh. Not usually, the two-toned teen dropped his gaze to his lap. He fiddled with the strings of the sheets and the edge of his bandages. I have one last question. When training you, did Endeavor ever go too far or push you too hard beyond what was appropriate? Todoroki responded, in the most dejected, defeated voice Aizawa had ever heard. The second the words were out of his mouth, Shudo felt regret. What was he thinking? Why would he tell Aizawa all that? He wasn't delusional. He knew his childhood wasn't great, but this made it seem like he was tortured as a child. It wasn't that bad. He didn't think so, at least. Maybe though, maybe some part of him, some pathetic, hopeful, childish part of him, wanted saving? Well, that was a bit dramatic. But he wanted something. Justice? Accountability? Maybe he really just wanted to forget all about it, for it to never be addressed again. No, he didn't want that. Yes, he did. No, he didn't. His head hurt too much for this. More than anything for his whole life, he wanted to feel safe. The question was, did he feel safe with Endeavor? Now that was a question he really couldn't and wouldn't think about. It was never something he thought about. Why would he? He had no other options and nothing he did would get him out of there, so what good would it do him to dwell on it? While stuck in thought, he watched as Aizawa took in all the information. He couldn't tell what was going through his head, but he doubted it was anything good. His teacher breathed deeply, signature eye bags looking darker than ever. Todoroki, what you've said is serious and will not be taken lightly. The tension in the air was thick, literally suffocating. Or maybe that was just Shudo's nerves and injuries talking. Sensei, what will happen now? Aizawa moved close again. He made sure to look Shudo dead in his eyes. It's hard to say for certain. These things can be complicated to say the least. I don't know what will happen when the charges are pressed. You'll probably have to give even more of a police statement, but I assure you Endeavor won't be anywhere near you. His teacher had said it with such confidence. Shudo was sure it was supposed to be reassuring. All he felt, though, was the slightest bit of relief that he wasn't hooked up to a heart monitor anymore and stone-cold dread. Won't be near Endeavor? Pressing charges? It was as if the entire world shifted around the hero in training. The blanket was a snake coiled around his body and his heart felt like it was going too fast and too slow all at the same time. His distress must have shown on his face, no matter how Shudo tried to hide it, because Aizawa moved closer, eyebrows drawn together. Todoroki, what's wrong? Shudo's mouth flopped as he tried to find the words. His mind was failing him, he just didn't understand. What do you mean, press charges? He eventually managed to say, if only just barely. He nearly gagged and choked at the end of the sentence. Aizawa gave him a strange look, somewhere between surprise and confusion. With all that you've told me, I think we have a solid case against Endeavor. Nearly cutting the man off, Shudo asked, what if I don't want to press charges? This time, Aizawa was all surprise, shock written into every centimeter of his body. Normally, a look that would be enough to send Shudo stepping back, desperate to undo what he'd said or done. Not this time. He could not let this nonsense get any further. He had to cut it out here and now. Todoroki, the hero started. His face and gaze softened much more than Shudo had ever seen. In cases of child abuse, legal actions will be taken no matter what. The law takes inarguable action because children can't abuse. No. That's not what he wanted, right? Things were getting better. Endeavor was trying to be better. This is what Fumi wanted, what his family needed. How could Shudo take that away from everyone so selfishly? Blinded by pure panic, Shudo did something he would never normally do. He grabbed hold of Aizawa's wrist and said, with much more bite than he thought he could manage, no. I don't want to press charges. There's no reason to. Aizawa carefully grabbed hold of the bandaged hand holding onto him. He didn't try to pry it off, just let his hand rest on top of it. Todoroki, what your father did was inexcusable. From what you've said, and my own observation and assumptions, Endeavor is in the wrong. He abused you. Blunt. Straightforward. Just as Aizawa always was. But it was just training. It was to make me a better hero. I seriously doubt it was, kid. I should have interfered earlier when I first noticed signs, and for that I apologize, but I will not let that happen again. Training should not begin with a child, and if it does, it should not involve any combat against a pro hero. The point of training is to improve in a safe and controlled environment. If it wasn't for that, to make me better, what was it for then? What am I for? Was everything I went through worth nothing? Shudo might have overdone it on that one, but he wouldn't take it back. His throat burned from raising his voice, like razor blades were cutting it from the inside out. He grabbed at his throat as if that would do anything to help, head hanging low. He desperately needed a breath, but his battered and bruised throat hardly let him. Through the thin hospital clothing, he felt his teacher put his hands on his shoulders, practically holding him up. In the background, Shudo vaguely heard Aizawa talking to him. Not that he could really hear it over the pounding in his ears and his own desperate gasps. It took longer than he was proud of, but eventually Shudo found his lungs expanding with a decent, full breath. He watched Aizawa crouch down into his sightline. That's right, just breathe. I know you don't understand right now, but you have to trust me. I have never done anything to endanger any of my students, and I'm not trying to do that now. You're a child, which means this isn't for you to deal with, and quite frankly it's not up to you. It's my job to report this and the laws to execute it. Shuto wheezed, it wasn't that bad. It shouldn't be bad at all, kid. If Midoriya went through what you did, would you be okay with it? It may be difficult, but you just have to let the adults handle it, Aizawa said with so much sincerity it hurt. He was right. Shuto didn't understand. He ran the words over and over again in his head, but it never truly made sense. Legal action against Endeavor? It couldn't connect in his mind. But what did connect was a singular truth that he couldn't deny. He had just ruined any chance his family had of being whole. Shuto didn't respond or even show he acknowledged the hero's statement. Luckily, he didn't have to. There was a knocking at the door and a nurse poked her head in. Sorry to interrupt, but I need to do a check-in now. Aizawa nodded, standing back up. He gave Shuto a squeeze and said, "Let me take care of it, kid." With that, the hero stiffly left the room. The nurse started to move about the room, though Shuto paid her no mind. He was far too preoccupied to think about her changing his bandages, adjusting his wiggling the needle in his arm. Okay, maybe he could think about that a little. Exhaustion and guilt weighed down on him, making everything harder to focus on. He failed his family, he failed Fumi. More than anything, she wanted them to be a family. Even Shuto wanted to see what his father would become. Now, no matter what happened next, they would never get to know. To top it all off, confusion ran rampant through his head. He couldn't remember being so casually called a child. And if Midoriya had his life? He would be furious. So why wasn't he about his own life? Because it was his life? Because he needed to be the best? Shuto wasn't dense enough to believe that. And then there was a little voice, buried deep under all the pain and confusion in his mind, that was a little relieved. What almost worried him was that he didn't know why. Hell, if he was going to figure that out now. Shuto just tried to relax as he followed the nurse's instructions and answered her questions to the best of his abilities. How was he feeling? Was he in any pain? How were the burns? Were the lights bothering him? How was his leg? He was fine, physically. As much as he hated to admit it, yes. They were raw and painful and itchy. A little bit. He never knew how irritating a cast was until now. 11 more minutes of adjusting his painkiller dose, administering a whole slew of other drugs Shuto had absolutely no idea what they were, and other medical whatnot. He was finally alone. In the dimmed room his body slowly relaxed, but his mind still ran at a million thoughts a second, swarming him but unable to understand a single one. No matter how much his mind was awake, though, it wasn't enough to fight his body. Soon enough Shuto's eyes drooped closed and he couldn't be bothered to open them again. The next time he did, his entire world would be flipped upside down. Aizawa muttered every curse under the sun as he left his student's room. His breath came out in aggressive huffs and his hand shook around his phone. Right under his nose, this whole damn time. And he called himself a hero. As an underground hero, he had done plenty of assignments helping kids from abusive homes. Yet he didn't even realize his student was one of those kids in need. He may have failed Todoroki before, but he won't make the same mistake twice. He held the phone up to his ear, the dull ringing only irritating him further. Finally, someone picked up. Not even bothering with a greeting, Aizawa said, "Yamada, I need a ride from the hospital. I have some things to discuss with Nedzu." Sure, Zawa. I can be there in 15 minutes. Is everything all right? You sound, well, pissed, Yamada responded. Of course, he'd be able to tell that Aizawa was seething with fury, but he did not have time for that. The longer he talked, the more likely he was to explode. Just get here as quick as you can, he ground out through gritted teeth. You got it, man. There were no goodbyes, Aizawa just hung up. And now he had 15 minutes to kill. He supposed it wasn't so bad, given he was feeling pretty murderous. He couldn't keep standing around. He needed to do something. Well, there was something he thought of. It didn't sound appealing at all though. Running a hand through his greasy hair. Wow, he needed a shower. Aizawa steeled his resolve and headed to the burn ward. Down the familiar hallway and past the bustling hospital life, until he made it to a very specific room. Through the glass of the door, he could see that both occupants were still there. He rapped his knuckles against the wood. "Come in." Inside, Fumi and Natsuo were sat on the bed almost exactly as they were before. Surprise was clearly written on their face when Aizawa walked into the room. Nevertheless, both Todoroki siblings smiled. "Oh, hello, Aizawa-san. Did you need something?" Natsuo asked. His eyes suddenly widened and he leaned forward. "Did something happen with Shudo?" No, he's fine. Or as well as he can be given the circumstances," Aizawa assured. The siblings sagged with relief and Aizawa couldn't help but think of himself when he arrived at the hospital. "There was something I wanted to discuss with you both." Fumi and Natsuo shared a glance, and the hero had a feeling they knew what was coming. They nodded, waiting for him to continue. Aizawa took a deep breath. This wasn't going to be an easy conversation. When I took Todoroki back to his room, he said something rather concerning. The looks on their face when he spoke said it all. He had no choice but to continue. "He said that he was trained by your father from a very young age, but from what he described and my own observations, it doesn't sound much like training. I was hoping you could elaborate on it." He couldn't tell what was worse, the fact that they didn't need him to explain or that they didn't look all that surprised. Natsuo cleared his throat. Weakly he asked, "Why do you want to know?" "Because I and UA will be opening up a child abuse case against Endeavor. We'll be going in-depth with the investigation, but if you could give us any information to start with, it would really help us get a good idea of what we're dealing with." Silence stretched in the tense atmosphere, no one willing to break it. That is, until Fumi reached out to her younger brother. She gripped his sleeve in her weak grasp. Her eyes spoke 1,000 words and she gave her brother a nod. Aizawa didn't know what it meant, but Natsuo did. He almost seemed thrilled to speak even if a darkness spread over his features. "The only reason our parents are together is because of a quirk marriage. Our father wanted a child with the perfect combination of his fire quirk and our mother's ice quirk. Our eldest brother, Tuya, had a really strong fire quirk, but he inherited our mother's weak constitution. Endeavor started training him when his quirk first manifested. But he didn't live very long. That bastard pushed him too far," Natsuo growled. There was clearly more to the story that Aizawa wasn't being told. Tears pricked the corner of Fumi's eyes and Natsuo's voice and body shook. This family had seen and felt real pain. Fumi and I were next, and we were deemed as failures. He ignored us practically our whole lives. Then Shudo was born and, as you know, his quirk was exactly what Endeavor wanted. Just like Tuya, he was trained as soon as his quirk came in. I'd hardly call it training though. It was more like torture. He was forced to fight against Endeavor long past the point of exhaustion, sometimes until he threw up. We hardly ever got to see him, he was so isolated, all his time devoted to becoming a weapon to beat All Might. Our mother tried to protect him, but Endeavor would hit her whenever she tried. Taking care of us became her whole life and all she ever did. It really took a toll on her, to the point where she poured boiling water on Shudo's face. Aizawa expected a lot of things. He never could have wanted to expect it to be this bad. If he didn't feel like a failure of a hero before, he really did now. Every word and detail Natsuo described made his heart sink, and his resolve grew stronger. Bowing deep at the waist, he said, "Thank you. I will make sure you and your family are safe. I promise." Fumi openly wept now, head shaking slightly from side to side. She opened her mouth, but not a peep came out. It only made her cry more. Natsuo wrapped an arm around his sister, barely keeping it together himself. The Todorokis didn't get the chance to respond, if they even wanted to, because Aizawa's phone pinged with a notification. Yamada had finally arrived. He bowed once more. God, he would never be able to express his apologizes enough, and made his exit. Meeting Yamada out in the car was one of the hardest things he'd done today, and that was saying a lot. Aizawa had no desire to explain the situation to his friend, nor dwell on it until he had to. He remained curt, straightforward when he told the voice hero to head to UA. Yamada didn't ask questions and Aizawa didn't answer. Instead, he rolled down the window and let the wind brush against his face, the sun pleasantly warming his skin. Maybe he fell asleep, maybe he didn't. All he knew or cared about was that for a little bit, he could really breathe. Relax. Eventually, it felt way too short for Aizawa's taste. They arrived at UA. The school hadn't changed a bit since the start of the break, but now it felt like an entirely new place. The gate that surrounded the grounds were the gates that failed to keep the danger away from Todoroki. The halls were the ones that Aizawa failed to notice his students' abuse. The principal's office, where he had discussed his students before, was the place he never talked about one specific student. It all felt darker, like one big lie. Perhaps it was the new perspective the underground hero adopted over the days with what he'd learnt. Or maybe it was his own cynicism and guilt projecting onto the place of his career, the monument of his failure. Nedzu-san, I have something urgent to talk about. Maybe he could turn that monument of failure into a monument of hope. I want to open a child abuse case for Todoroki Shudo. Nedzu and Yagi stared at the teachers that had burst into his office, Aizawa leading the charge with Yamada bringing up the rear. The principal's ever-present smile immediately became a bit more forced. Yagi straightened in his seat. Any of the teaching catch-up work he had been discussing prior died on his tongue. I wish I could say I'm surprised, Nedzu started, lacing his paws together. I'm assuming you've learned some troubling new information that prompted this serious development. I have, sir. Do you have a minute? Confusion. Lots and lots of confusion. And a surprising lack of pain, which only added to that confusion. When Fumi woke up, she expected to see a lot of things. Pearly white clouds, nothing, her home engulfed in flames, her father standing over her. She didn't expect to see, albeit rather blurrily, blank white walls and plain white ceiling. Oh, a hospital. She supposed that made sense. If memory served her right, she had been quite injured if how painful it was had been anything to go off of. In that case, she felt pretty lucky to be in a hospital, let alone open her eyes at all. Look who decided to wake up. Good morning, Todoroki-san, a nurse said. He had curled horns like a goat and a bright, cheery smile. Sitting up, she was going to properly greet him, but was quickly cut off before she could utter a word. I wouldn't say anything just yet. We had to intubate you for a while there, and that plus the smoke inhalation won't make for a pleasant experience. Well, that kinda sucked. If you take it easy for a while, and drink something when you can, you should be able to talk for a little bit in a few hours or so. She nodded to show her understanding. In return, Fumi got another radiant smile and her glasses. At least this nurse made it easier. The nurse filled the space of the inevitably somber environment with casual chatter about everything he was doing. Oxycodone, ketamine, morphine. Don't worry, we won't keep you on that one for long, he assured with a wink, went into her fore. He explained all the different effects and why they were being used. Of course, Fumi had no clue what half of it meant. Nevertheless, she smiled, nodding along. Once all the general medical upkeep was complete, they moved on to the hard stuff, explaining her injuries. The Todoroki daughter knew it wouldn't be good, she recalled enough of what happened to know that. She still couldn't say she felt ready to hear the news. If it weren't for her extensive knowledge of burns, common knowledge in the Todoroki household, the medical jargon would have gone right over her head. The moment the nurse said third-degree burns, Fumi had a jarringly clear idea of what she was getting into. She listened as he described the surgery and the skin grafts held with surgical staples that were hidden under her bandages. The doctors felt confident that they could minimize scarring, even to the larger burns on her face. She didn't know how she'd feel about staples on her face in the meantime, but Fumi could manage. The nerve damage on the other hand, or rather throughout her body. The surgeries went well, and we even had a doctor with an astounding healing quirk, but, I'm sorry, Todoroki-san, given how extensive some of the burns were, we doubt you'll be able to feel much of anything, if at all, in some of those areas again. Only time will tell. With the proper treatment and care, everything else should be okay. It'll be long, hard work, but worth it. In all honesty, it could have been much worse. So much worse. And yet, Fumi found herself feeling devastated. Her face, both arms, her leg, and both feet have been burnt, and now she might not feel anything in them again. Such a simple, basic thing that she had never really thought about. Gone. It made her want to cry. Maybe it was just because it was something all her that was taken away without anything she could do. I wonder if this was how Shudo felt. Shudo. Fumi started to fidget, not sure how to explain what she wanted. She tried spelling out the word brother, but that worked about as well as expected. Which was to say quite awfully. She tried asking for the nurse's paper and pen, and he still didn't get it. You know what, I'm going to need you to hold that thought for a moment, Todoroki-san. I was supposed to get your brother once you woke up, the nurse announced before leaving the room. He couldn't have remembered that earlier? She thought. Thankfully, the young man had already left. Fumi would have hated for him to see her absolutely dumbfounded face. At least he has a great personality. A few minutes later, heavy footsteps echoed down the hall and her room door was flying open, making the poor Todoroki sister recoil. She tried to look more scolding. They were in a hospital for crying out loud, but she couldn't help but smile when she laid eyes on Natsuo's relieved face. Stupid little brother. Natsuo rushed in, door closing behind him. His arms flailed as he attempted to find a safe place to touch, eventually settling on brushing against her fingers. Hey, sis, the younger Todoroki said with a wobbly smile. It's so good to see you're okay. Well, relatively speaking. Unable to respond, she just nodded and took a firmer grasp on his hand. One brother right where he should be, now where was? Shudo's okay too. As good as he can be, at least. I mean his surgeries went well. He hasn't woken up yet. They think he's going to be just fine, though. Thank goodness. It felt like a weight unraveled around her body. Her brother was alive. He was going to be okay. That just left one lingering question, one that she didn't want to think about, and wouldn't until she had more information. Father. Until then, Fumi listened to Natsuo talk and talk and talk. She smiled at the distraction, happy for anything to keep her mind occupied. He talked about Shudo's injuries, his teacher being here, garbage hospital food, and even calling into her job for her best little brother ever. He talked for hours, and she even found she could respond every so often. She needed to when he made fun of her singed hair. Not that he was wrong, she would definitely need a haircut after this to try to fix the unevenness. Under different circumstances, it would have been just another time the two siblings were hanging out, only ever interrupted once by a phone call. When Natsuo hung up, he looked disturbed. She didn't know if that was the right word, but he certainly looked unhappy now. And that was when he told Fumi about what happened with their father. That the man was innocent. She could have cried with relief. A quirk? A freaking quirk. It made so much sense. Their father may not have been a very good father, or man debatably, but he would never intentionally hurt his family, and he didn't this time. Relief didn't begin to describe how Fumi felt. Of course, Natsuo didn't share the sentiment. By the look on his face alone, Fumi could tell he wasn't as thrilled. She'd be the first to admit the situation was not the best, but how could he not see that the reality of things was much better than what it could have been? Needless to say, the mood had been significantly dampened by the news. The Todorokis were clearly at odds, though neither wanted to discuss it. Not that Fumi really could. Natsuo felt this was another nail in the coffin for their father, another proof that the man was irredeemable. Fumi, on the other hand, thought this was just another terrible misfortune that befell their family. It wasn't until late in the day Natsuo decided to head back to Shudo's room. Good night, Yumi. I'll keep you updated on Shudo. See you tomorrow. And just like that, Fumi sat in silence. She wished some music were playing or something to fill the space other than her own thoughts. Looking for any sort of company, she turned to the stars only barely beginning to show in the darkening sky outside her window. She wondered if her mother was also looking at the stars right now. She always enjoyed it. I wonder how we'll explain everything to her. Will it hinder her progress? So many thoughts and nowhere to put them. Maybe it would be better if they didn't tell her at all. That felt a bit devious though. She was still their mother after all and had a right to know. But at the expense of her mental well-being? Fumi supposed it would be up to the family and her doctors then. Obviously, nothing she could do about it now. Despite having done nothing today, the Todoroki girl heard sleep calling her name. She'd honestly be embarrassed if she weren't so tired. Well, it wasn't like she had anything else to do today. Wrapping herself in the pathetic hospital blanket, Being mindful of the bothersome four, Fumi snuggled into the bed. Fumi jolted awake, an absolute ruckus pulling her from sleep. Glancing at her clock, it read 2:10. What on earth would wake her up so early? Then she heard it again. The unmistakable sound of shouting and banging echoed throughout the entire house. No wonder she woke up. What was going on? The air was stiflingly hot. That was until the temperature rapidly dropped and she heard the crackle of Shudo's ice. That couldn't be anything good. Not in this house. Fumi scrambled to her feet and rushed to her door. The second she wrenched it open, she saw Shudo bolting down the hallway, looking battle-worn. "Shudo!" She called after him, but he didn't stop. Was there a villain attacking their home? Where was their father? She soon found her answer. Further down the hall, she heard something shatter, and suddenly flames were consuming the house. "Don't run from me, Shudo." "Father? What was he doing?" The man came thundering down the hall, fire following him as he went. He had a few scrapes and scratches, and he looked downright murderous. He was on a warpath and Fumi knew that her little brother was the target. Not if she had anything to say about it. She had no clue what was going on, but no one would hurt her brother. Taking in a strengthening breath, Fumi stepped in her father's path. The smoke had gotten thicker, choking the Todoroki daughter. She wouldn't stand down now though. "Father, the house is on fire, we need to get out now." "Not until I teach that worthless failure a lesson in proper combat," the man said, completely unbothered by their home being burned away. This didn't sound like the man she called father. He was many things. A homicidal rage monster was not one of them, no matter how much Natsuo argued to the contrary. So, Fumi stood her ground. "No, you will not hurt my brother, your son. We need to evacuate. And who's going to stop me?" Just like that, the Todoroki father backhanded his daughter with a flaming fist. Fumi fell to the ground, knocking into the wall on the way down. Enji went to keep moving, but a grasp on his ankle halted his movement. Even as stunned as she was, Fumi held tight to her father. She refused to let him get any closer to Shudo. He wasn't the #1 hero for nothing. With a single stomp of his foot, Fumi was now the one engulfed in flames. And it hurt. A lot. It made her scream, agony ripping through her throat as she gently used her quirk to try to quell the fire around her. She knew from experience to never strongly ice a burn. Her mother taught her that, but it was so hard to think straight at all through the blinding pain. The most she really could think of was that Endeavor was getting and her vision was getting darker, until it faded into nothing. Fumi woke with a jolt. Her ragged breath lodged in her throat, forcing painful coughs to tear through. She felt a little humiliated that a dream memory could affect her so much. And when she glanced out the window, the light of dawn just barely started peeking over the horizon. Dear God, it's not even really morning yet. There was no way she could go back to sleep, not with the way her heart raced right now. She just needed to breathe. Huffing, she relaxed, as best she could, back onto the bed and stared out the window. What she wouldn't give to have Natsuo barge into her room right about now. Younger her would probably have a heart attack at the thought. Well, younger her could suck it. Fumi wanted some company. As it were, her thoughts weren't very good companions. All they did was scare her, reminding her of events she couldn't change. It was ridiculous to be afraid of something accidental, right? It wouldn't happen again, so there was no reason to be scared, right? Maybe if she thought it enough, she could believe it. Fumi sighed, staring out the window. She counted the fading stars and watched the moon begin to fade too. The view really did take her breath away. From the vantage point, she could see so much of the city and the creeping light of dawn. It captured her attention, calmed her heart. She barely took notice or cared when the hospital woke up with the rising sun. Outside and inside her room, movement surrounded the white-haired woman. She could forget her troubles and remember those beautiful little things that put a smile on her face. She didn't bother to take notice of the time passing. She wasn't going anywhere. She did notice, though, when there was a knock at her door and something, or rather someone, entered to make her smile grow even more. So, when Fumi saw her brother wheeled into her room, she wanted to cry with joy. Both her brothers were here together with her, like one little reunion. Just beyond the door, she could see who she vaguely remembered as Shudo's homeroom teacher, but she didn't mind at all. In fact, she felt pretty darn grateful to see the man who saved her brothers still looking out for him. He may have looked pretty rough, but to Fumi, Shudo looked like another ray of sunshine. She hated that he was injured, that she couldn't have helped him, that their father put him there. The second he was close enough, Fumi cupped the teenager's cheek, regardless of how much her hand shook. Her whole body really. Worth it in the end because yes, Shudo was very real. Fumi's heart skipped a beat when he didn't pull away, and even reciprocated the gesture by gently touching her hand. With every rise there just had to be a fall, though. Shudo, looking utterly guilt-ridden, told her, "I'm sorry." She may be a teacher, but she needed someone to explain that to her. He was sorry? If anything, Fumi was the one that needed to apologize. That would have been a lot to say, so she shortened it to simply, "W.I.? I shouldn't have left you behind. I could have warned you or distracted him." Nope. Not going to let that continue anymore. The older Todoroki tapped Shudo's nose, effectively silencing his nonsensical rant. She shook her head. No little brother of hers would be feeling guilty unless she made the guilt trip herself. "Thank you very much." No, but, no, it was your fault. She couldn't bring herself to say it. She couldn't make herself say the words. Their father was to blame for this misfortune. She knew it, Shudo certainly knew it, probably everyone in the room knew it. And yet, she didn't want to bring it up. So, she didn't. What would have been the point? Doesn't Ven H. Ert. She said instead, tapping Shudo's nose one more time. Such a shame, she probably wouldn't be able to do that again anytime soon. She was the big sister, teasing, generally annoying, and booping younger siblings was supposed to be in the job description. Her family never really cared for traditional family interactions, though, did they? The sentence sent her into a sharp, coughing fit, but it still felt worth it to her. That was until Natsuo stepped in and reprimanded her, "Take it easy, sis. You probably shouldn't talk anymore." There. Natsuo, Mr. Stay up to 4 a.m. cramming for a test until his blood was nothing but pure caffeine, was lecturing her about what she should do. He was probably right, but still. She coughed once more and smirked as she said, "Lil bro, it had hurt." Yeah, it hurt a lot. But it was another worthwhile sentence given the look on Natsuo's face. He looked simultaneously indignant, offended, and relieved. This was right. This was exactly what family was supposed to be like. Natsuo, recovered from his sister's sass, suggested, "Shudo, why don't you go back to your room and get some rest? You look like you need it." Once again, he was probably right. Fumi had taken care of Shudo a lot for a long time, seen him when could barely stand or think straight, and she knew he was losing steam. That was okay. Having any time with him, and after such an awful experience, satisfied her easily. At least Shudo went without fuss. "I'll come visit you later, Fumi. I promise." "Natsuo, you should stay here for a while." She had such a sweet little brother. Of course he would say such a thing. He would make an incredible hero someday. Fumi took Shudo's hand in hers and put it to her face. Leaning into the slightly callous touch, she pressed a kiss onto his palm. And Shudo said it back. "I love you too." Fumi was starting to get a little embarrassed about how excited she was from these simple little actions. Aizawa, timely as ever, re-entered the room ready to take Shudo back. He better get some serious rest because he clearly needed it. Before they could leave, seconds away from the door, Natsuo called out to the hero. "Take care of him for us." She couldn't have said it better herself. And she felt more than relieved when he said just 2 short words. "I will." "He's a good man," Natsuo said once the door closed. "A real hero." Fumi believed it. With all her heart. Despite being raised in a hero-centered household, she never cared too much for heroes. But she couldn't lie that they did good. A lot of good. Aizawa did good. Maybe they weren't all so bad. A comfortable sort of silence settled between the 2 siblings, both ruminating on their family, their life, their heroes. Their opinions undeniably clashed, even if they weren't said aloud, but it was okay for now. Except, there was just one little thing Fumi had to say. She tapped Natsuo on his broad shoulder, making sure she had his full attention. "Didn't tell me WH to Dio?" He blinked once. Twice. "Are you kidding me?" There went the comfortable silence. Now, the sister and brother were engaged in war. Fumi may not have been able to talk, but that didn't stop her from going verbal blow for blow with her little brother. And Natsuo didn't let her disadvantage slow him down. Maturity went out the window along with the silence. Years passed, generations were born, and there was no end in sight. Okay, it hadn't been that long, but it was probably far longer than any two grown adults should have argued for. They were so distracted, it came as all the more surprise when someone knocked at her door. "Come in," Natsuo said, though it sounded more like a question with how confused he was. When Aizawa walked into her room, Fumi couldn't stop the surprise from showing on her face, no matter how much she would have wanted to. At least she recovered quickly enough. After all, she didn't want to seem rude in front of her little brother's teacher, the person that very well saved his life. Thankfully, Natsuo greeted the man. "Oh, hello, Aizawa-san. Did you need something?" Natsuo asked. His eyes suddenly widened and he leaned forward. Did something happen with Shudo? Oh God, if anything more happened to her little brother, she didn't know if she could take it. Her breath hitched painfully in her throat. Who was she kidding? Everything was painful right now. The underground hero hastily assured them that everything was fine. There was always a but though. Because nothing could ever really be fine for the Todoroki family. The universe hated them too much for that. The two siblings glanced at each other. She knew what was coming, and she had a feeling Natsuo did too. How could she not? It was bound to come up given what happened. She just prayed that it wouldn't. Nevertheless, the two nodded for Aizawa to continue. "When I took Todoroki back to his room, he said something rather concerning." "Oh no." "He said that he was trained by your father from a very young age, but from what he described and my own observations, it doesn't sound much like training." "I was hoping you could elaborate on it," Aizawa finished. And there it was. Plain and simple. He didn't even have to explain. Everyone in the room knew exactly what he referred to. Thankfully Natsuo spoke up, asking the million-yen question, "Why do you want to know?" "Because I and UA will be opening up a child abuse case against Endeavor. We'll be going in-depth with the investigation, but if you could give us any information to start with, it would really help us get a good idea of what we're dealing with." Right then and there, Fumi was sure her heart had stopped. They're opening a case against her father. He is going to be charged, investigated. Their family and everything they've gone through, their whole life, would be judged under the scrutiny of complete strangers. And there was nothing she could do. One way or another, the truth would come out. So, Fumi took hold of her brother's sleeve. She looked him dead in the eyes and nodded, hoping he understood what she was trying to convey. It was time. The darling brother he was, Natsuo seemed to understand. It was no secret that he hated their father. He was always ready to complain about the man or their childhood. This time, even he looked hesitant to divulge their life. He began telling the hero about their life, starting with their parents' marriage, but Fumi stopped listening from the very beginning. She didn't need to hear this, she had lived it. She had bigger things to concern herself over. Who was covering her class? Where was her father? Did her mother know about what happened? She probably had quite a bit of grading to catch up on. Oh yeah, and everything she had worked for, the family she had worked for, would soon be meaningless. Okay, maybe that was a bit dramatic, but there was certainly some truth there. For the longest time, Fumi had dedicated her all to having a warm, loving family. One that supported each other and spent time together. She had always tried to take care of them the best she could, even if Tuya never listened. When Tuya was gone, she comforted Natsuo, assuring him there was nothing he could have done. Tears pricked the corner of her eyes at the thought of Tuya, her only older brother. When their mother went away, she watched out for Shudo, making sure he still felt loved. From the moment her life started to fall apart, she strived to keep all of her family together, pushing past her own pain of being a failure. Fumi wasn't blind though, despite her need for glasses. She knew her childhood was wrong. No one should have had to go through that. Not her mother, her brothers, or herself. But it was different now. Changes were made in all of their lives and they were happier now. Then why say anything now? Why help at all? First and foremost, because she was afraid. She had always been at least a little afraid her father. It would be a miracle not to be. After witnessing all that he had done, all that he was capable of, she would be a fool not to. Then it was a matter of working past her fear, to better herself as a person and be happier. This time, there was no going back, no redemption, no getting over. Fumi would never be able to look at her father again without cowering. Even if it wasn't his fault necessarily, she was so all-consumingly terrified. The very idea of seeing him again sent shivers down her spine. And if that was even remotely close to what Shudo or Natsuo, or Tuya, felt, then she didn't want them anywhere near their father. Dreams be damned. They could be a family all on their own. Maybe it was selfish of her to only think of this now, but maybe she could be redeemed. Maybe she could make amends, starting with admitting her fault and keeping Shudo safe. No matter how hard it got. That was the other thing that always held her tongue. Who would believe her? A top-ranking hero abusing his family? Unheard of. Unbelievable. Blown out of proportion. So, if she couldn't fix her situation, why not try to make the best of it? But this man in front of them? Thank you. I will make sure you and your family are safe. I promise, Aizawa said, giving the siblings a deep, respectful bow. Was a real hero. Fumi couldn't stop the tears if she wanted to. Her face felt tacky, the bandages were getting uncomfortably wet, and her glasses weren't making anything easier. When she opened her mouth to try to thank Aizawa properly, nothing came out. Speaking had already been a struggle, while crying it became impossible. It only made her cry harder. She needed to thank Aizawa, to apologize to her brothers. She had so much to say and no way to do it. Natsuo's arm did provide her with comfort, but not enough to dry her tears. At some point or another, Aizawa left, and the moment he did, Natsuo's efforts to console her increased tenfold. Hey, are you okay, Yumi? No, right, dumb question. I guess I know why you're so upset. No, that's not it, she thought, head shaking frantically. That's not it at all. Well, maybe a little. That wasn't what was really important though. Leaning into the younger Todoroki, Fumi tried to pour all her love into the contact. There was no way Natsuo would understand everything she wanted him to this time. At least he could know she loved him. And when she could talk again, she would tell him and Shudo just how sorry she was. Maybe someone could get her some paper. On second thought, words were worthless. She'd show them instead. With her actions, she'd prove to her brothers, and herself, that they were all they needed to be a family. She didn't need their father to be a family. Yagi Tashinori knew he was not the perfect hero, and he'd be the first to admit it. He couldn't always save everyone. Sometimes keeping structures intact wasn't his strongest suit, and on more than one occasion he cut it way too close. He wasn't perfect. No one was, and he wouldn't pretend to be. But Yagi also knew that he was a good hero, and he gave people hope. That, in and of itself, was enough to placate some of the guilt for all his failed missions, if only a little bit. He couldn't save everyone, but he saved a lot of people. He could be proud of that. He even made strides in becoming a better teacher. And he had no experience in that department. Look at him now, though, sitting in Nizu's office discussing students' progress and possible lessons for the coming weeks. He felt pretty dang proud of himself. That was until Aizawa barged, quite literally, into the principal's office. Nizu-san, I have something urgent to talk about. I want to open a child abuse case for Todoroki Shudo, Aizawa announced. His shoulders were set and his eyes hard. He was deadly serious. I wish I could say I'm surprised. Yagi did too. Nizu continued, I'm assuming you've learned some troubling new information that prompted this serious development. Sir. Do you have a minute? Nizu nodded for him to proceed, and thus began one of the most painful experiences of Yagi's life, and that was saying a lot. He's almost died multiple times. Neglect, quirk marriages, physical abuse, all of Endeavor's misdeeds were laid out on the table. Including the fact that Todoroki was made to defeat him, All Might, the #1 hero. Yagi felt downright sick. Endeavor had told him, flat out said it at the sports festival, that's why he made him. It certainly concerned him at the time, and he did question it in the moment, but he never went back to it. He let Endeavor walk away without explaining a single thing. He had been concerned, outright suspicious, and Yagi let him go. Why did he do that? Why would he let someone potentially dangerous go? Why didn't he stop Endeavor right there and demand to know what he was doing to his child? What kind of hero, teacher would do that? The principal's eyes darkened in a rare display of displeasure, though his trademark smile remained in place. I see. We'll have to do something about that now, won't we? Neither Yagi nor Aizawa responded. They didn't feel like accidentally incurring the wrath of the small mammal. Instead, they watched him riffle through his drawers, pushing paper after paper aside in search of something. He went deep into his desk drawers, nearly inside, when Nizu finally pulled out what he was looking for. Files, and more files were placed on the desk separating the teachers from the principal. This will be a good start, Nizu said. The slightest hint of mischief played in his eyes despite the situation. Given that you're a hero, any investigation can, and I assume will, be handled directly by you with the police. These forms will get the ball rolling. There's also the matter of temporary custody that would need to be discussed with the boy. Yagi could tell by the look on Aizawa's face that the man was steeling himself to take it all on. He already looked ragged enough, it would be detrimental for him to take on any more. Maybe this could be the chance to be a hero again. To save the one that got away. Standing out of his seat, Yagi announced, "If I may, sir. I've worked closely with both Endeavor and Detective Tsukachi. I can take care of opening the case. Aizawa can focus more on Todoroki. He's going to need all the support he can get." The looks sent his way were surprised to say the least. They didn't deter Yagi in the least. He may not have been one for pushing papers in his hero days, but this was the least he could do now. "That would probably be best," Nizu started, "but I will leave that decision to Aizawa." All eyes turned to the scruffy underground hero. Any surprise he had on his face was replaced by a look of deep doubt, clearly reticent to relinquish such a personal case. It hurt a little more than Yagi thought it would. It's not like Aizawa had been shy about his discontent for flashier heroes, but the former number one couldn't really blame the man. He just hoped he made the right call. Rubbing his dark eyes, Aizawa conceded, "You're right. The more help we have the better." Pride swelled in Yagi's chest, then almost immediately died when he remembered what exactly he was needed for. Nevertheless, he thanked them for their trust. He would do everything in his power to make sure it wasn't misplaced. The principal clapped his paws together. "Now that we have that settled, here is the paperwork you both will need. Of course, I imagine you'll need a day or two to review the files and compose yourselves. After all, Aizawa, it doesn't take someone of my senses to tell you need some time for personal hygiene." Hiding the humor, the absolute amused shock, became such an incredible struggle for Yagi. He didn't need to paint a target on his back from the man. Any more than he already has at least. A cough was used to oh so cleverly disguise an escaped chuckle. Apparently not well enough, given the whole Aizawa tried to glare into the back of his head. Win some lose some, he supposed. And he was damn sure going to win Todoroki's battle. Yagi gathered the copious amounts of papers and forms, Aizawa following his lead, and started combing through them. Court orders, hearings, investigation forms, so on and so forth, all neatly put together with a paper clip. Yeah, he was going to need a bit of time for this. The safety of our students is the most important thing to UA. I know you both will take this as a top priority with the utmost care, Nizu said. Though the smile remained on his face, a deep regret and sadness lay just below the surface. One Yagi recognized from the many tragedies that had struck this class already. The two teachers bowed to their superior and took their leave. No other words were exchanged. They knew what they had to do. It wasn't until they were at the towering gates of UA's entrance, the former number one looked to Aizawa. This won't be easy by any means. Endeavor's never been one to let go. Is this supposed to be helpful? But if there's one thing I've learned over a long career, is that the second you give up is the moment you've really lost. You have to hold on to the idea that we've got a shot. The underground hero stared at him for a long moment before he gave something that sounded akin to a chuckle. I'd expect nothing less cliché from you, All Might. Okay then. Here Yagi was trying to help Aizawa out, remind him to keep his hopes and head held high, and this was what he got for his efforts. He couldn't say he felt particularly surprised. But, Aizawa interrupted his thoughts, I appreciate it. Thank you. That was probably one of the only, if not only, genuine thanks Yagi had ever gotten from the man. And it made his heart swell with gratitude. He thought Eraserhead deserved much higher praise than what underground heroes received. He respected the man greatly, seeing how far he was willing to go in his work of all kinds, and it was a trait Yagi admired above all else. To hear praises from him made Yagi want to try to live up to, deserve that thanks. He held out his hand to Aizawa in a show of thanks, solidarity, and too many other things that could never possibly be conveyed in a single handshake, but he would sure try. And when the younger man took his hand, Yagi thought that he did it. They stayed like that for a moment more before parting ways to prepare for their upcoming fight. And man, oh man, did Yagi need to prepare. By the time he got back to his room in the teacher's dorm, he still couldn't quite process what he learned. He flopped down into a chair at his table by the window. His head fell into his hand, away from the glorious shining stars. It seemed cruel for the sky to look so beautiful when something so painful has just been divulged. His head continued to spin with the realization of how blind he had been. All of this, an entire family's suffering, was because of him. No, that wasn't quite right. Yagi couldn't take all the credit. Endeavor was the only person who hurt his family. He chose to lay a hand on his wife and children and devote all of their lives to an obsession he couldn't let go of. So no, Yagi could never be wholly responsible for the abuse. Still, he couldn't help feeling somewhat responsible. He had seen signs, worked personally with Endeavor, and yet he said nothing, did nothing. He gave the benefit of the doubt. He never even tried to talk with the man's wife or children alone to try to learn their situation. He did nothing. What's worse was what if Yagi could have kept going? What if All Might still stood? Endeavor would never have changed. The so-called hero only realized the error of his ways following his achievements of what he'd always wanted. So, what would have happened if he had never gotten that coveted #1 spot? Would it get worse? How long would Todoroki have suffered under his hand? How far would Endeavor have gone, especially with the new hero rankings approaching at the time? The possibilities mounted and swirled in his mind, until Yagi could hardly bear it. At this point, it almost seemed fortunate that All Might reached his end when he did. Otherwise, well, it was probably best not to continue that thought. With a need to stop his ever-growing corkscrew into guilt, regret, and possibilities, the former #1 started to look over the papers in greater detail. Goodness, there were so many steps it looked like it would take forever. Hopefully, they could work quickly, for Todoroki's sake. If speed was the goal, he might as well start now. Pulling out his phone, Yagi began to work on a lengthy email to Detective Tsukachi. Thankfully, it wasn't very late, so there was a good chance he would see the email sooner rather than later. The next morning, Yagi found himself staring up at the towering police headquarters, the light reflecting off the windows into his eyes. He walked inside the building, the air conditioning tousling his hair, and the second he made it in he could already tell this was going to be a long day. Somewhere deep in the halls, past the front desk and the countless offices, the walls rumbled with a deep booming voice. He couldn't quite make out the words yet, but he recognized the voice and the tone behind it. "I'm guessing I'm supposed to go down that way, huh?" Yagi said to the poor desk worker. She looked all too ready to quit. "I think you'll be able to find them well enough." "Thanks," he called as he went on his way. Poor girl. He should try to convince someone to give her a raise, if not just because of the one interaction he knew she had. The closer he got, the more he could hear, until eventually he stood in the doorway of a plain-looking conference room. "What is the meaning of this, Tsukachi? Explain why on earth I am not allowed to visit my own children in the hospital." Yagi knew that voice. He entered the room, and he swore the temperature had risen 20 degrees from the hallway. At the center of it, of course, was none other than the flame hero himself. There were few people in the room, only Tsukachi, a woman in a well-pressed suit, and a few officers placed by the door. Too caught up in his staring down the detective, Endeavor didn't even notice Yagi's presence. Tsukachi did though. "Ah, Toshinori, you're finally here. Now, we can get things started." All eyes turned towards him, Endeavor seemed especially hostile, as if Yagi had already done something to him. The man just got here. What's going on? The flame hero asked again. The detective gestured for Endeavor to take a seat, not that he took it. Not surprising. Nevertheless, Tsukachi sat down and continued unfazed. Todoroki Enji, you are now under investigation for 4 accounts of child abuse, including neglect and physical abuse. What? And while investigation is ongoing, your hero license will be suspended indefinitely. Before Endeavor had a chance to say another word, the woman spoke up. Todoroki, my name is Noda Yoshi, I'm the social worker handling this case. In addition, you will not be allowed to see or interact with your son Todoroki Shudo unless mandated by someone of the proper authority. Now wait just a minute. Let me finish. Shudo will also be taken into protective custody until further notice for his own safety. Now I am done, Noda-san finished. Everything about her read no nonsense, no tolerance, and Yagi liked it. Though he hid it well, the former number 1 could see the proud smugness on Tsukachi's face at Endeavor being put in his place. Speaking of Endeavor, he was fuming. Quite literally. Smoke rolled off his body and the tips of his flames turned white. A deep scowl carved its way into his features. Voice filled with venom, he growled out, "What the hell are you talking about? We talked to your son, both of them actually. They had some pretty damning things to say." Yagi cut in. The reaction was instant. Whether or not Endeavor realized what they were referring to before was irrelevant, because he definitely knew now. His face relaxed and his fire simmered down. The new number 1 sighed. It's not what it sounds like. Oh really? That one took Yagi by surprise. Somehow, he must have swapped quirks with Endeavor because his blood was boiling. It isn't. I'll admit, I wasn't a very good father, and I did sometimes go too far, but I never abused them. Besides, it was in the past. I'm better now. I never intended to hurt them. They were always safe with me. Endeavor never got to finish that sentence. Yagi didn't allow him to. Because for a split second, he transformed back into his muscular form and punched the so-called hero right in the face. He deflated almost immediately following, Endeavor stumbling back most likely in surprise. Blood spewed past his lips like it always did as he leaned against the table for support. But it was fucking worth it. Tashinori, are you alright? Yagi ignored him, choosing instead to focus on Endeavor. How dare you? How dare you stand here and pretend you did nothing to your children, your wife? You were more than just a bad father, you were their tormentor, you son of a bitch. You wanted to be a better man. Well, part of that is facing the consequences of your actions and reaping what you sow. Eyes wide, Endeavor just stood there, for once completely silent. That silence didn't last long though. You can't take away my son, he whispered. Louder, he repeated, shouted, you cannot take away my son. Noda-san stood, adjusting her suit. I assure you, Endeavor, we can. I won't stand for this. I will not allow you to tear my family apart, Endeavor declared, storming towards the door. The officers positioned by the entrance went to block his path, but Tsukachi waved them off. Don't get too comfortable. We'll be seeing you again soon for questioning. The hero seemed to ignore the order and pushed out the room. He was probably on his way to assemble his team of lawyers and PR, but Yagi couldn't bring himself to care much. They had shaken Endeavor, brought the man down to size. He liked their chances. He couldn't wait to bring down one of the most corrupt villains this world has never seen. As much as Aizawa hated to admit it, he did need to go home for a bit, and he certainly felt refreshed after taking a shower. Now, entering the hospital for yet another time, he was ready to face the difficult conversation he had ahead of him. At least he had a very easy one to warm him up. One with the nurse working at the front desk. Well, it would have been. Apparently, Todoroki could be discharged today, a celebratory matter in and of itself. The difficulty came with the matter of who would sign him out and where he would go after. And this was supposed to be easier. In the end, Aizawa forewent signing anything, barely even acknowledging the proposition to do so, and headed down the increasingly familiar halls. When he got to Todoroki's room, all he found were mussed bedsheets, not a soul in sight. For crying out loud. The more he had to search for him, the more he dreaded the upcoming conversation. Every second spent walking through the halls was another second Aizawa had to think of all the what-ifs. How would he even start? Hey, Todoroki, glad you're still alive. Listen, you're going to be removed from your father's custody, and since your mom's in a nut house, she can't take you. Got any other preferences? Yeah, no, not doing that. On the plus side, he knew where the kid was at least. There was really only one place for him to be. It didn't take long for Aizawa to reach that other familiar door yet again. He knocked gently, but didn't bother waiting for an answer, already knowing what it would be. Just as he thought, on the inside all three Todoroki siblings were lounging about someplace on or close to the bed. Todoroki perched on the edge of the bed close to his sister while Natsuo sat in a chair off to the side. They looked considerably better from the last time Aizawa saw them. Most of the tension had released from Natsuo's shoulders, a natural, genuine smile easily gracing his face. Todoroki looked much more alive than he had been over the past few days. His skin actually had some color in it, and some of the bandages had been removed, leaving nothing but faint scars in their wake. Recovery girl must have visited him earlier today. He still had a bulky cast, one with a poorly drawn cat on it, but hopefully that wouldn't last long either. Upon his entrance, the atmosphere shifted. Aizawa suspected it had to do with their conversation yesterday, only yesterday? It felt like much longer than that, a lifetime ago. Regardless, Fumi hesitantly smiled and waved while Natsuo did the same. Unsurprisingly, Todoroki remained about as blank-faced as he normally did. Or maybe that was his version of a smile. It was kind of hard to tell. Aizawa cleared his throat and said, "I'm glad to see you all seem to be doing better." Various thanks were exchanged and other meaningless pleasantries. Normally, the underground hero hated those sorts of things, but now he almost wished it could drag on for a little while. No use trying to delay the inevitable. I talked to Principal Nizu about what you told me yesterday. Thank you again for trusting me with that information. Each face took on a different look of guilt, and Aizawa would be lying if he said he wasn't right there with them. We've begun to launch an investigation, Aizawa continued. Detective Tsukachi, a highly regarded social worker named Noda Yoshi, myself, and only a few select others will work on this case. We will be keeping this out of the public eye as much as possible. We'll see how long that lasts, Natsuo muttered, only to be flicked on the ear by his older sister. It was decided that for the duration of the investigation, and hopefully forever if all goes well, it would be best for Todoroki to be removed from Endeavor's custody. The question is, whose custody does he go into? The silence that cut through the room spoke more than anything any one of them could have said. The two older siblings exchanged glances back and forth, opening and closing their mouths but not saying anything. Todoroki sat between the two of them, watching their exchange. Clearly, he knew what they were thinking, and he had some thoughts on the matter too. Before anyone else could have said something, the hero in training jumped in. Do I really need a guardian? I could just stay in the dorms over breaks. It's not just where you go outside of school, kid. It's about having an adult to watch out for you, to do the things that children aren't supposed to worry about. Like signing your discharge papers, Aizawa said, giving the kid a pointed look. Besides, you can't stay in the dorms over breaks. There'd need to be a member of staff somewhere on campus, and I can guarantee you they're all going home. The kid looked downright indignant at being called a child. It was just another reminder of how problematic these damn problem children were. At least, unlike other times, Aizawa had backup. He's right, Sho. You need someone to properly be able to look after you. I can take custody of him, Natsuo told the hero. Fumi cut in before Aizawa could respond. No, you can't, she said. You're not old enough. Only 19. She's right. You need to be at least 20 years old, Aizawa confirmed. Well, you can't look after him, Yumi. You couldn't afford it. I don't need anyone to look after me. The nervous, unsure silence from before was replaced by the self-righteous argument only siblings could produce. Admittedly, trying to understand what they were saying was a bit of a challenge, but Aizawa managed to decipher their stances. Fumi, while old enough, couldn't afford to take care of the kid. Natsuo wasn't old enough and didn't even have a place for him to stay, and Todoroki adamantly believed he didn't need a guardian at all. In short, neither Fumi nor Natsuo could reasonably be a guardian for him. He'd have to be put in a foster care system. It may not affect him much during school, but when he'd have to go home, if he even had one by that point. I could stand as Todoroki's guardian, if you're willing. Shudo had no expectations when he woke up. Recovery girl visiting and healing him up? Total surprise. Learning he'll be able to take off that stupid, uncomfortable cast in a few more days? Even better. The 2-hour-long nap he ended up taking? Not intended, but incredibly welcome. Getting to visit Fumi hassle-free this time? Best thing to happen all week. His sister insisting on apologizing, though, had well and truly floored him. The second he was close enough to Fuyumi's bed, the older Todoroki wrapped her arms around her brother and held him as close as she dared. The affection caught Shudo off guard, almost making him fall over. He felt a little ashamed by how relieved he was when she let go before he had a chance to react. He just really wasn't ready for it. Fumi pulled him back so they were looking eye to eye, still closer than they've been in years. Your teacher talked to us? Oh no. Shudo knew they'd find out eventually, but he was hoping he'd never actually have to talk to them about it. Maybe they could pretend nothing is wrong. He'd be fine with that. But no, instead his sister of all people is the one to bring it up with him. I'm sorry. Fumi, it's just... And there was a hand over his mouth. If she wanted him to shut up, there were other ways to do so. One that smelt less like burn cream. I'm the one Dichetsusai Shudo? Now that was a surprise. So much so, Shudo entertained the idea that he might still be sleeping. Yeah, somewhere deep in the folds of exhaustion-induced sleep. But no, this was very real. He could feel it in her soft hand, in the rough texture of the bandages, and see it in Natsuo's own shocked face. We told Aizawa-san. I was wrong. Our family doesn't need a father. I'm sorry. Only once she finished, did Fumi remove her hand. By that point, though, Shudo had absolutely nothing to say. Really, nothing came to mind in the form of a response. His chest filled with an overwhelming warm feeling. She spoke out against endeavor? She gave up on one big happy family, her dream? I'm sorry, Shudo tried again. If it weren't for me... Geez, Shudo, take the apologies when and where you can get them. Natsuo interrupted, flinging an arm around his little brother's shoulder. I know it's hard for you to accept, but it's not your fault. It's none of ours. Now let me have my nice sibling bonding time, damn it. He punctuated his sentence by pulling his siblings in for what would have been an aggressive hug. For now, though, it was still a wild comfort and one of the best hugs Shudo had ever gotten. Sibling bonding time? He supposed he could do that. Shudo honestly thought that would be the most surprising thing to happen all day. That was until Aizawa-sensei came knocking at the door. Of all the things he might have expected the man to talk about, the investigation, Endeavor's reaction, even going back to school, guardians and custody were not in the top 100. He didn't need someone to look after him. He never had before, so why would he now that he's older? The best and obvious solution would be for him to stay in the dorms and do what he's always done, watch after himself. Apparently, though, his brother and sister disagreed. No clue why. And why should they be allowed to tell him what to do? Sure, they're older, but he knew what was best for himself. It seemed like their argument would never end, forever going back and forth. You're not old enough. You don't make enough money. I can take care of myself. Maybe they could make an exception just this once. That's not how the law works, idiot. It all came to a screeching halt when Aizawa said, I could stand as Todoroki's guardian, if you're willing. Like he said, today was full of surprises. Wild, unexpected surprises. Natsuo began floundering, in a way not unlike Midoriya. Fumi, practical as always, asked, what would happen if he didn't? Shudo was starting to get a little frustrated that they were talking as if he weren't even here. Nevertheless, he found himself leaning in to hear the answer. If you can't find a suitable guardian, he would be placed in a foster home, Aizawa said. Strangers. He would live with strangers. That sounds quite awful. No knowing who they'd be or what kind of people they'd be. After all, Shudo knew better than most that people aren't always what they seem. Who else could he go with then if his siblings weren't suitable? His mother? He didn't need to give that any thought. grandparents? He didn't even know them. Was that seriously the only people he could think of? Was there really no one else? His options really were limited, he supposed. Shudo? The choice is yours, Fumi said. Yeah, Natsuo agreed. Whatever you choose, we've got your back. He hated when decisions were put on him. Sure, Shudo could make them if he had to, but then every consequence would be solely his fault. At least when someone else made the decision, he could work through the results good or bad without any of the guilt. It might be selfish, but it made him feel a lot better. I wouldn't want to be an inconvenience, sir. I wouldn't offer if I thought you would be, kid. I know you won't. Straight to the point as usual. Well, Aizawa was an honest teacher. And if he said it was okay, then if it's all right with him, I guess I'll go with Aizawa-sensei. The second he said it, Shudo wanted to take it back. And for no particular reason. He just had a feeling that he had made a terrible mistake, one that needed to be rectified immediately. He knew too much about mistakes and their consequences. No one allowed him to take it back, though. They smiled encouragingly with those soft, kind eyes. Even Aizawa had a hint of a smile on his face. Whenever you're ready to leave, I'll take you back to the dorms, the hero said before taking his own departure. The door shut with a gentle click, leaving the siblings alone with their thoughts. Shudo waited for a blow-up of some sort, for his sister or brother to tell him off. Maybe he shouldn't have really been surprised by what they did say. Maybe if he knew them better, he wouldn't have been. He seems nice, although a little scary, Fumi ended up saying. A little? If it weren't for the fact that he saved your life and is a hero, I'd assume he were some angry homeless man. Natsuo. Don't say that. Natsuo flinched away from Fuyumi's backhand. What? We were all thinking it. I assure you I wasn't. He thought to ask just to be sure that they were okay with what he chose. But after hearing that utter nonsense, though he couldn't deny how right Natsuo was, Shudo knew he was okay. It was all going to be okay. For once, he really thought it would be. Yes, Aizawa's appearance is rather unkempt. The sound of Fuyumi's admonishments and Natsuo's laughter stuck with the teenager for the rest of the day. Shudo stayed with his family for another 4 hours before he figured he should be heading back to UA. He missed his friends and a general feeling of normalcy. Still, he promised to visit as often as he could. Aizawa said he would make sure it was often. Those simple words brought such a look of joy to Fuyumi's eyes like Shudo had never seen. Just like seeing the sun did for Shudo. He never realized how much he appreciated the sun, the warmth on his skin, or a breeze through his hair. It felt astounding. Even the crutches wedged under his arms felt like a blessing. Sure, he was somewhat clumsy, but being in control of his own movement, and not bound to some ridiculous wheelchair, was a win in his book. He hardly minded the long ride back to the dorms with his teacher, nor was he bothered with being swarmed by his classmates. Their incessant questions, expressions of worry, and shining faces brought back that warm feeling in Shudo's chest. Bro, where have you been? We've been trying to contact you this whole time. Yeah, we've been like super worried about you for days. We saw the fire on the news. You should have informed us of your safety. Where the fuck have you been, icy hot bastard? It's good to see you again, Todoroki-gun, Midoriya said, though not with his usual cheer. Something in his eyes seemed much heavier, sadder than the occasion would have warranted. Did he? We can talk about it later. If you want. Leave it to Midoriya to figure out what happened. Yeah. Later was all the younger boy could manage. For a while, things were normal. As normal as it could be given the circumstances. Shudo went back to classes, though he was barred from physical training for obvious reasons even after his cast was removed. Aizawa told him the papers were signed and he was now officially his guardian. A strange sensation to be sure, but better than any of the alternatives. Yes, things were normal and perhaps that was the reason Shudo was so caught off guard. Maybe if he expected the worst, he could have prepared for anything that would come next. He supposed that was what happened when he didn't expect anything. Because all of a sudden, one random day, it was all around UA, the city, everywhere. No one knew how it started or where it came from, but it rocked the foundation of everyone's faith. The media scrambled to pump out as many articles as it could over what showed up at its feet. A large stack of papers, filled with pictures, secret doctor's examinations, and scathing accounts of everything that went on in the Todoroki household. Attached to the top of it all was a simple handwritten note. The past never dies.